Hello everyone, I am MANO Scaling, and I am here to help you today. I know you use this video to fall asleep, so before that, please like the video and subscribe to the channel, and also tell me where you are from and what time you are watching. Now get comfortable and relax. My name is Mark Tilman. I was 34 years old when all of this happened in late October of 2022, deep in the Atchafalaya Basin of Louisiana. I had driven down there with my dog, Duke, because I believed I could isolate myself in the swamp, wrestle with my writer's block, and prove, at least to myself, that I could handle living out of a backpack for a few days. I had no idea that by journeying into those murky waters and moss-hung trees, I would find something far older and far more dangerous than I could ever have imagined. If you're reading this, I urge you, stay away from the Atchafalaya Basin. Because if something is there waiting, it might already know your name. I suppose this story starts with failure. A month before I left for the swamp, I lost my job as a magazine editor. It wasn't exactly a shock. The company had been shedding staff for years, but losing my job so suddenly rattled me. To make matters worse, my girlfriend of 3 years had left me shortly after, saying I had become unbearable to be around. Maybe she was right. I felt worthless, and I couldn't bear the sympathy of my friends in the city. More than anything, I wanted to disappear, to find solitude, let nature clear my head, and maybe find some new purpose as I pieced together the draft of a novel I'd been half-heartedly outlining for years. So I packed up the old SUV and headed into Louisiana's deeper reaches. Duke, my 6-year-old black Labrador, sprawled across the back seat, panting happily. He had no idea we were about to go off-grid. He was just content to be with me on an adventure. I, on the other hand, had some idea of the hardships ahead. I had read enough online guides about the Atchafalaya to know the swamps were dangerous. Venomous snakes, alligators, unpredictable weather, even sinkholes. Yet, I also read how peaceful it could be, how rewarding. Photographers from around the world came to capture the region's haunting beauty. Cypress knees rising from the water, Spanish moss trailing from gnarled branches like wispy curtains. It would be perfect for finding my footing again. I just didn't realize how quickly the swamp would remind me that all illusions of control can vanish in an instant. By the time I pulled onto a narrow dirt road leading to the water, my GPS was stuttering between different signals. It kept trying to reroute me, but I was so close to the campsite I'd marked on my map that I ignored its frantic suggestions. Driving deeper, with no cell service, I felt a slight twinge of dread. This was exactly what I'd wanted. No distractions, no quick exits. I rolled down the windows and took in the pungent smell of swamp water, rotting vegetation, and the undertone of brine. It was late afternoon, but the sunlight was already fading behind the cypress trees, giving everything a hazy, golden glow. As I parked, a wave of dizzy relief hit me. At last, I was here. Whatever here would turn out to be. I got out of the car, let Duke stretch his legs, and immediately noticed how quiet the place was. The typical calls of birds or the whirring of insects seemed oddly distant. A breath of wind rustled the canopy, and Spanish moss swayed like ghostly veils above. I trudged a few hundred yards in, found a patch of damp ground beneath 3 large cypress trees, and set up my old canvas tent. Duke waddled around, sniffing everything. At one point, he let out a low whine and stared into the gloom. Nothing was there, at least nothing I could see. I shrugged it off as dog nerves in a new environment. After I hammered the last tent peg, I realized the sky was already dark, far darker than I expected for that time. I checked my watch. 6:10 p.m. Sundown this time of year should have been around 6:30 or so, yet the swamp looked like midnight. Strange, I thought. Maybe the thick canopy just made it seem darker. I tried to light a campfire with some purchased kindling. That's when the first of many small, inexplicable things occurred. The fire burned with a strange tint. Sometimes the flames licked up a vivid green or flickered a faintly sickly purple. I chalked it up to chemicals in the damp wood or minerals from the swamp. But the hair on my arms stood up just the same. Some primal part of me was disturbed. Night fell quickly. I ate a modest meal of canned stew, letting Duke have a portion of my supply since I wanted him to be comfortable. I was in my folding chair searching the blackness of the swamp for a sign of movement or sound when I heard a faint, lilting music. It was so soft I thought it was my imagination, the whine of insects pitched into a tune. But after I listened closely, I was certain I heard it. A melody, like a fiddle or violin, drifting on a breeze I could not feel. "Anybody out there?" I called. Duke's ears twitched, but he didn't bark. No answer. The music stopped as soon as I spoke. I shrugged off the unease and crawled into my tent, with the Duke settling on his dog bed by my feet. I planned to read, but exhaustion tugged at my eyelids, and I fell asleep to an unusual hush. At some point in the night, I jerked awake to the intense smell of sulfur, a chemical sting like lighting 100 matches at once. Before I could even react, Duke growled. The tension in that low rumble spiked my heart rate, and my first frantic thought was that a snake or gator had found its way in. I fumbled with my flashlight, shining it across the tent. Nothing. The smell dissipated. Duke eventually settled back down, though it took him a while to close his eyes. I stayed awake, feeling like something was outside our tent, staring at us. The next morning, I clambered out onto damp earth, blinking in the watery light. I realized it was still early. The sun was only just cresting the horizon. I went to rummage in my pack for breakfast. That's when I discovered half my supplies had rotted. Not everything, but specific items. A bag of jerky and a vacuum-sealed pouch of dried fruit were covered in a foul-smelling mold that had definitely not been there yesterday. It was impossible for sealed items to go bad overnight in such a dramatic fashion. My first rational explanation was that moisture from the swamp had found its way in. But as I picked up the packaging, it practically disintegrated in my hand, black with slime. The stench made me gag. Duke sneezed, shaking his head, and wouldn't go near it. Confused and alarmed, I tossed the ruined food into the brush, cursing under my breath. I was down to a fraction of my provisions. Before letting the bizarre incident weigh on me too much, I forced myself to enjoy the morning. I boiled water, the canister stove still worked fine, and made a small cup of coffee. Coffee grounds being the only supply that hadn't gone bad. Then I decided to do what I came here to do. Explore, take notes, get a feel for the environment for that novel I was always talking about. I carefully stowed my gear, triple-checking that everything was sealed, and set out with Duke to follow one of the narrow trails that wound deeper into the swamp. We walked for maybe half an hour. The ground was spongy beneath my boots, the air thick and humid. The drone of mosquitoes circled incessantly, but oddly, they rarely bit me. It was as though they circled, recognized something, and fled. Even Duke was constantly shaking his ears to ward off invisible pests. Eventually, we broke into a clearing where the water spread wide around cypress knees. And there, on the far side of that clearing, stood an old shack. I almost missed it at first, just a small shape huddled among the mossy trunks. It looked abandoned, with rotting boards and a sagging front porch, as if the swamp would soon swallow it whole. Curiosity wrestled with caution. Still, I'd come to get a taste of local color, right? I told Duke to stay close, and we approached slowly. A musty smell, tinged with decay, wafted from the shack. The door hung on a single hinge, creaking in the breeze. I was about to peer inside when a voice made me jump. "Lost, are you?" I spun. A man stood behind me, barefoot in the mud, wearing a faded red coat that seemed many decades out of style. He looked to be in his 40s, with a narrow face, short unkempt hair, and a strange grin that showed teeth a little too white. He held a fiddle under his arm. My heart hammered as I realized I'd been so focused on the shack that I hadn't noticed him sneaking up. "No, I'm not lost," I managed to say, forcing a casual tone. "Just exploring. Didn't know anyone lived out here." He let out a quiet chuckle. "Ain't many do." He glanced at Duke, who had begun a steady growl at his presence. "You hush now. I mean no harm," he said, though I didn't find his voice reassuring at all. He turned back to me. "Name's Lucien Roussel." I introduced myself, trying to ignore the rising discomfort that churned in my stomach. "It's a nice place to get away from things," I added, waving lamely at the swamp. His eyes gleamed. "Indeed, folks come here to forget, or to be forgotten. Which are you?" I hesitated. "Guess I'm here to clear my head." Something about the man's posture and the atmosphere around him pinned me in place, like I was a mouse cornered by a cat. Despite the muddy ground, his bare feet looked almost too clean, and a faint smell of sulfur clung to the air around him, that same chemical tang I'd noticed last night. "I know 100 ways to clear a man's head," Lucien said softly. "Got any troubles you'd like to be rid of?" I stammered something about being fine. Then I took a step back, hoping Duke would follow. Instead, Duke let out a short, sharp bark as if protesting this entire encounter. Lucien's grin widened. He said, "The night's coming fast. Best be careful." I turned, half expecting him to vanish into thin air, but he stayed there, watching as Duke and I hurried away. I didn't look back until we were well clear of the shack, and he was gone. The memory of his face followed me all the way back to camp. My mind whirled with questions, but I tried to rationalize. He was just a hermit, or some weird local drifter. This was a big swamp, after all. I was relieved to find our campsite undisturbed when we returned. Yet, the second I stepped under the cypress canopy, I smelled that faint trace of sulfur again. I rummaged in my gear for a snack and discovered more rot. This time, half of my bread and a sealed pack of crackers were blackened with mold, as though they'd been sitting in a damp cellar for months. My frustration turned to dread. I'd gone from well-stocked to nearly empty in a single day. Worse, my phone had no battery left, despite having been at 60% that morning. I tried to turn it on, and it remained stubbornly dead. Was it the humidity messing with electronics? Some sort of chemical effect from the swamp? Everything seemed so improbable. With no phone and only partial maps, I had to rely on memory and my old compass to navigate. But I hadn't prepared for the possibility of spoiling supplies. If this continued, I wouldn't have enough to last the planned 5 days. That night, I tried to keep a fire going, but it refused to catch with any real heat. The flames spat up weird colors again, almost mocking me. I gnawed on the few remaining granola bars I had left and gave Duke what was left of his dry kibble. Somehow, that bag wasn't ruined. Duke ate, but afterward, he lay with his head on his paws, quietly whining and glancing around as if he expected an intruder. Tension knotted in my shoulders. There was no one else out here. Nobody except the strange man in the red coat. I forced myself to lie down in the tent. That sulfur odor drifted in and out of my senses. Something was definitely out there. Occasionally, I heard faint footsteps passing near the campsite. I called out once, and the footsteps stopped. Then they picked up from a different angle, circling. There was no normal wildlife movement, no coyote howls or typical rustling in the brush, only the distinct sound of bipedal steps. I managed scraps of sleep, plagued by nightmares. In one dream, I saw Lucian dancing around my campfire, fiddling a jaunty tune. In the dream, the sky was blood red, and Duke lay motionless at my feet. I remember rising to chase Lucian away, but when he turned, his face melted like wax, revealing twisted horns. That's when I jolted awake, covered in sweat. Morning light eased some of my fear, but not all. Once I coaxed myself out of the tent, I instantly noticed that my second backpack was missing. I had left it just beside the tent flap, full of spare clothes, a metal pot, and various small items. Duke was still with me, so no one had stolen him in the night, but the pack was definitely gone. There were no footprints, no disturbed earth, just an empty patch where the bag had been. A creeping sense of unreality wormed into my brain. Could it be I'd moved it myself in some half-lucid state? I scoured every inch of the site, behind trees, in the tent, nothing. It was gone. This was theft or some unnatural phenomenon. Either way, I was furious. After a cup of coffee, the only other thing not spoiled, I decided I needed to look for the bag. If it was stolen, maybe I'd find tracks near the old shack. I stuffed what was left of my gear, including my notebooks and water, into my largest pack and strapped it to my back. Then I told Duke to stay alert, and we headed out again. The sky seemed dull and lifeless, even though it was mid-morning. The insects were subdued, humming in fits and starts. Duke walked stiffly beside me, as if on guard. The further we went, the more I noticed something was off with my sense of time. I glanced at my watch, which read 9:15. We must have walked for an hour, yet the watch still read 9:20 when we reached the clearing with the shack. I assumed my watch had stopped, but the second hand was still ticking, just slower than normal. I tapped the face a few times. No difference. The sense of unreality deepened. I felt as though the swamp was distorting the normal flow of day and night. The shack looked even more decayed in the daylight. Bones dangled from the eaves by rough twine, rattling in the faint breeze. Could they be animal bones? Human bones? My stomach churned at the thought. Duke barked sharply, but we pressed forward. The door was still askew. Inside, the floor was little more than caked dirt. A stench of rot and old blood assaulted my nostrils. I couldn't tell if it was from the shack or from a dead animal. The entire place felt diseased. There was no sign of Lucian. I poked around, mind racing. A battered table, scattered with old candle stubs, sat in one corner. A broken mirror lay in another, shards of dirty glass catching the watery light. Scrawled across the walls were symbols I didn't recognize, like twisted crosses, half-finished pentagrams, and letters in some script I couldn't read. My heart pounded as I realized I was trespassing on something deeply wrong. Then I saw the footprints. Not just one set, multiple sets, barefoot, pressed into the dirt floor. Some looked like they belonged to a child, others to a large man. But they overlapped in unnatural patterns, as though a group had been circling the shack in some ritual dance. My scalp prickled with dread. Did Lucian have others with him? Why did they come here? In the far corner, I found a small pile of personal items. A broken watch, a rotting wallet, a single muddy sneaker. I forced myself to check the wallet. A few disintegrating bills, an ID for someone named Thomas Crosby from Lafayette, Louisiana. My hands trembled. When I turned, I found a fresh carving on the wall, M. Tilman. My name, cut deep into the rotten wood. My mouth went dry. Lucian must have done that after we'd first met. At that moment, Duke let out a piercing bark and bolted out the door, chasing after something. I ran out after him, calling his name. He tore through the mud, bark echoing, but then I heard a yelp that made my blood run cold. Duke's bark cut off abruptly. Fear leapt into my throat. I sprinted across the clearing, screaming for him. No trace of him. I wandered among the cypress, shouting, pushing aside drooping moss, calling his name. Dead silence. Eventually, with no sign of him, I fell to my knees, breathing raggedly. This was my fault. I'd come here, ignoring every warning sign. Now, Duke was gone. A swirl of panic and guilt hammered my thoughts, telling me I had to keep searching. But the morning sunlight seemed to dim overhead, and I realized time had slipped again. My watch read 2:45 p.m., but the sky looked more like dusk. Desperate, I roamed the swamp for hours or minutes. It was impossible to know. The light never changed consistently. At times it felt like early afternoon. At others, the shadows stretched long and mocking, as though the sun were about to set. I found no footprints, no broken branches, no sign of Duke. My throat was raw from calling his name. When I returned to camp, the entire day felt as though it had vanished. My legs ached, and I was drenched in sweat. I looked at my watch, 5 o'clock p.m., then 8 o'clock p.m., then 7:30 p.m. The hands wavered, as if dancing backward and forward in time. A sense of vertigo nearly toppled me. Swallowing fear, I realized the only thing left to do was to survive the night, then attempt to hike back to my car at first light. Maybe I could get help from the authorities. Only problem, the keys to my SUV were in my missing backpack. As if on cue, a fiddle's melody drifted through the swamp, curling around my campsite like an invisible serpent. It was the same haunting tune I'd heard the previous night, only now it sounded closer, mocking. My fire sputtered and died. I tried to rekindle it, but every stick I found was waterlogged or refused to light. Each time I struck a match, the flame curled sideways and flickered out, as though an unseen breath snuffed it. That night, I didn't sleep. I huddled in the tent, clutching my hatchet, a short tool meant for chopping wood, not fighting. Each noise set my teeth on edge. The rustle of leaves could have been a breeze or something creeping closer. The periodic sulfur smell made me gag. I was trembling and half delirious when dawn finally broke. Except dawn might be the wrong term, because the sky was a dull gray, as though the sun couldn't quite crest the horizon. I crawled out of the tent, half expecting to see Duke bounding up happily, as if this were all a nightmare. Instead, a more horrifying sight greeted me. A single, neatly wrapped bundle resting on a tree stump near my campsite. It was tied with twine and stained with dark splotches. I inched toward it, ice settling in my veins. It smelled faintly metallic. With trembling hands, I undid the twine and peeled back the damp cloth. Inside lay raw meat, at least 2 pounds of it, pinkish red, flecked with white sinew. Part of me wanted to believe it was venison, left by some local hunter. But the shape of one chunk vaguely resembled a dog's flank. Tears stung my eyes, a choke in my throat. I felt my world tilt dangerously. Clutched in the folds was a piece of scribbled parchment. A gift. Write something worthy. The handwriting was a chaotic scrawl. I dropped the bundle and staggered away, retching. I knew then that Lucian had Duke, or worse, yet some frantic sliver of hope told me maybe Duke was still alive, and this was just a terror tactic to break me. The alternative was too horrifying to accept. I kept hearing Lucian's voice in my mind. You got troubles you'd like to be rid of? That cryptic question had twisted into cruelty, or maybe it was always cruelty from the start. Shaking with rage, I decided that I would not leave without finding Duke, or avenging him if it was too late. I choked back my sickness, hoisted my big pack, and took my hatchet in hand. I had no illusions that I was any sort of wilderness warrior, but I was determined not to simply let Lucien toy with me. Either I would find my dog, or this swamp would claim me. I made my way back to the shack, adrenaline and raw fear pushing me onward. With each step, my surroundings felt more unstable. The cypress trees seemed to fold in on me, their twisting roots forming shapes almost like faces. The water lapped at the base of the trees, and the entire swamp looked stuck in some twilight limbo. Occasionally, I'd check my compass, only to see the needle spin aimlessly. My paper map was no better. My planned routes didn't match the twisting paths in front of me. The terrain rearranged itself, funneling me in circles. I found the shack again by near accident, or perhaps by the swamp's design. This time, faint candlelight glowed from inside. I approached quietly, my heart pounding. Through a gap in the splintered boards, I glimpsed Lucien. He was seated at that battered table, fiddling a slow, mournful tune. In front of him was a jar containing some black, tar-like substance. My missing backpack leaned against the wall behind him. I couldn't see Duke, but that jar alone made my stomach churn. My plan, if I even had one, was to confront him, demand Duke, fight if I had to. But as I neared the threshold, the music seized my limbs in a kind of paralysis. I froze, eyes wide, muscles locked. My mind screamed, but my body refused to respond. Lucien finished the final note on his fiddle, then turned, cocking his head with a knowing smirk. "You're persistent," he said. His bare feet crunched over the dirt floor as he approached. "But I told you, this swamp is mine. You come here, you pay a price. You want your dog back? Are you sure?" I tried to speak, but my vocal cords refused. My entire body trembled. Lucien bent forward, bringing his face close to mine. His breath reeked of sulfur. Under the candlelight, I noticed his eyes had a faint red glow. "I can fix a man's problems," he whispered. "You came to me wanting to forget. You said your life was in ruins. Let me help you. Or do you wish to keep on struggling? Because I always enjoy a good chase." He reached out and brushed the side of my cheek with a calloused thumb. The contact sparked a jolt of numbness through my face. Then he turned and walked away, leaving me frozen. He lifted the jar from the table and poured out thick black sludge onto the floor. It hissed, forming a pool that stank of old blood and charred metal. I realized tears streamed down my cheeks, but I couldn't move a muscle to wipe them. With a sharp laugh, Lucien set his fiddle on the table. "You're already part of the song," he said. "The question is, will you finish it or leave it half-written?" Then he spoke in a tongue I didn't recognize. Guttural, rhythmic. Candle flames leapt, casting twisted shadows on the wall. My mind teetered on the edge of panic. Suddenly, the paralysis broke. I sucked in a massive gasp of air and stumbled backward, nearly falling off the porch into the mud. Lucien walked calmly to the door, arms folded behind his back. "Go on, then," he said. "Run along. We'll see how brave you are come sundown." I didn't wait for more. I fled, hatchet in hand, crashing through the foliage. My thoughts were wild, frantic. He's not human, he's something else. No, that was impossible. But what normal man could freeze me in place, alter the swamp's reality? My rational mind was battered by the experiences of the last 2 days. I thought of the stories of deals with the devil. Was that Lucien? Or some demon masquerading as a man? At some point, I found myself near a small clearing that I recognized as part of an old trail. My plan? Get back to my car, break the window if I had to, and tear out of this place. But I didn't make it. The route seemed endless, twisting, as if I were walking in a labyrinth. My watch read times that were nonsense. Jumping from 2 p.m. to 11 p.m. to 5 p.m., my breathing became ragged. Eventually, I spotted my SUV in the distance. Relief coursed through me. I ran forward only to slam into a sheet of water. The entire ground gave way, dropping me waist-deep into thick, slimy mud. I flailed in a panic, trying not to sink further. Gasping, I managed to crawl back to firm ground, covered in mud, my muscles burning. I looked up to see that the car wasn't there anymore. It was just more cypress trunks, gnarled roots, and flickering shadows. Exhaustion hammered me. I screamed. No one answered. No one was here to rescue me. In near delirium, I wandered until I found a small patch of slightly higher ground. There, I tried to build a fire, but everything was too soaked with swamp water. Cursing, I used the last few pages of my notebook as kindling. Finally, a sputtering flame licked up, though it was too small to be more than a sputter of light. Then I saw a shape coming out of the darkness. I raised my hatchet, adrenaline spiking. It was Duke, or at least it looked like Duke, silhouetted in the gloom, head lowered. My heart soared momentarily. "Duke!" I cried. He trotted closer. In the flickering firelight, I saw he wasn't wagging his tail. He wasn't whining or barking. His eyes glowed with a strange reflection, and he just stared. "Duke?" I repeated, voice trembling. I reached out, and he pressed his muzzle against my palm. A wave of relief mixed with revulsion. He smelled wrong, like rotting algae. His fur was damp and cold to the touch. Still, I sobbed, hugging him. I was so desperate not to be alone that I refused to see the warning signs. Duke stared at me a little too long, blinking too rarely. When I pulled away, he just sat there, silent. Normally, Duke would have slobbered or licked my face, wagging his tail. Now, he watched me with a blank expression. Yet, in my relief, I told myself he might be traumatized by whatever had happened to him. I told him it would be okay, that we'd get out together. I spent an hour stroking his fur. Eventually, hunger gnawed at my insides, but I had no more rations. Everything was gone or spoiled. The fire died to embers, and night tightened its grip on the swamp. I heard the fiddle music drifting again. My watch said it was 11:30 p.m., but for all I knew, it could be dawn or twilight. The sense of time had become entirely meaningless. At some point, exhaustion pulled me down, and I dozed off. I can't say how long I slept, but I was jerked awake by the feeling of eyes on me. In the faint glow of the dying embers, Duke was still staring. No, watching. He seemed more alert than before, his head cocked at an unsettling angle. I froze. "Duke?" I whispered. No response. Then he bared his teeth, a silent snarl. I instinctively drew my hatchet closer. This wasn't my dog, not anymore. My mind spun as I remembered the raw meat in the cloth bundle, and realized that maybe Lucian wasn't lying. Duke might be dead, or part of him was, and what had returned was a twisted shell under Lucian's control. Trembling, I scrambled to my feet. Duke stood too, hackles raised. I backed away slowly, uncertain. Then, without warning, he lunged, jaws snapping. I screamed, swinging the hatchet. He twisted aside impossibly fast and circled me, saliva dripping from his mouth. My heart thundered. This wasn't right. Duke was older, slower. He could never move with such lightning speed. My companion, the dog I loved, was gone. He sprang again, aiming for my throat. In desperation, I swung the hatchet in a wild arc. The blade sank into his side with a sickening crunch. Duke, this possessed Duke, let out a gurgling yelp. I tried to pull back, horror flooding me, but he snapped at my arm. Teeth raked my skin, drawing blood, but I managed to wrench free. Sobbing, I yanked the hatchet out and swung again, tears blurring my vision. The second strike landed in his spine. Duke collapsed, convulsing. Foam bubbled at his jaws, and that horrific glow in his eyes flickered. In those final seconds, for just an instant, I thought I saw the real Duke in his eyes. as if he were begging me to end his torment. With a shuddering cry, I drove the blade in once more, ending his suffering. Silence fell, broken only by my ragged sobs. I cradled the dog's body, sticky with blood, trembling. My best friend was dead by my own hands. Or had he already been dead, I didn't know. The entire moment was a nightmarish blur. Eventually, I forced myself to let go and stumble away. Through tear-streaked lashes, I saw a faint glow on the horizon. Firelight in the direction of the shack. Lucian. I wanted to kill him, or at least confront him, or beg him to bring Duke back if there was any chance. My mind reeled from the possibility that he was behind every second of this cruelty. Fueled by grief, I marched through the swamp, following that glow, ignoring the briars that tore at my arms and the mud that sucked at my boots. By the time I reached the shack again, I was exhausted, caked in filth, bruised and scratched. The door was open, candlelight and flickering firelight dancing within. I stumbled inside, hatchet clutched in numb fingers. Lucien stood near the table with his fiddle cradled under his arm, but he wasn't alone. The flickering shadows seemed to coalesce into multiple shapes, each wearing that same too-wide grin. The shapes twisted, half-seen. Some had no faces, others had red pinpoints for eyes. My stomach twisted in primal terror. "Congratulations," Lucien said, voice echoing weirdly. "You proved your resolve, though it cost you." He nodded, as if in appreciation. "Now you're free to accept my gift. Let the swamp fix your mind, fill your emptiness." I couldn't speak. I only let out a strangled cry and hurled myself at him, hatchet raised. He sidestepped gracefully and I stumbled, scraping my knee on the dirt floor. He laughed. The shapes in the corners tittered in strange, hollow voices. "You can't kill me," he said. "Not like this." But raw anguish had turned me into an animal. I lunged again, hooking the hatchet at his legs. This time, I felt contact. The blade connected with a satisfying thunk. He hissed, staggering. The illusions flickered, like a momentary disruption in a film reel. In that instant, I saw his face melting, revealing a horned silhouette. I saw bones and sinew twisted together, a roiling mass of darkness behind them. Sulfuric smoke billowed from the wound. He screamed, a high, inhuman sound, as if countless voices cried out at once. My mind nearly snapped. But I saw a chance, and I swung the hatchet again, embedding it in that writhing mass of flesh. The force of the blow dislodged something from him, some portion of his essence. Candlelight flared, and the shack rattled as if in an earthquake. The shadowy figures around the room shrieked and vanished. Lucien collapsed to one knee, eyes glowing bright red. He coughed out a thick, tarry fluid that bubbled on the ground. A stench of sulfur and brimstone flooded the shack, making me gag. "Oh!" he croaked, voice layered with a demonic echo. "I could have given you everything." I yanked the hatchet free and stumbled back, my vision swimming from the fumes. The walls of the shack seemed to pulse, the floor swirling as if the world around us was unraveling. Summoning every ounce of will, I grabbed a burning candle from the table and hurled it onto the floor, igniting the tar-like substance. Flames erupted in a whoosh, devouring the shack's old wood. Lucien shrieked, slamming a hand to the wound in his leg. The fire licked at the rotting boards, climbing the walls in hungry tongues of orange. I staggered out of the shack into the night air, my chest heaving. A blast of heat chased me as the blaze took hold. Thick, black smoke curled into the sky. Even from a few yards away, I felt the scorching heat on my skin. As I watched in grim fascination, the entire structure burned like tinder, collapsing in on itself. Over the roar of flames, I heard one last echo of that fiddle tune, warping into a horrible cacophony of screams. I expected relief, or maybe victory. But all I felt was an endless, yawning dread. With the shack ablaze, the ground beneath me began to quake, as though the swamp itself heaved in protest. The cypress trees groaned, the water churned, swirling in unnatural eddies. My equilibrium faltered. I stumbled, pressing my hands to my ears against the rising din. In the flicker of the towering flames, I caught a glimpse of a shape crawling out of the fire, a half-burned figure dragging itself on all fours. Embers clung to it, and it glared at me with molten red eyes. Once again, a wave of terror slammed into me, but I forced my legs to move. I ran. I didn't care where. I had no plan except to get away. It felt like hours, maybe it was minutes, trudging through the swamp in near darkness, the only light coming from that infernal glow receding behind me. The ground shifted unpredictably. Tree limbs snagged my clothing. My arms bled from scrapes and insect bites, and my lungs burned with each panting breath. At times, the horrifying shrieks of that dying monster echoed behind me. At times, silence. Eventually, the forest thinned, and I found myself on a small gravel road. My heart leapt. I recognized the road from when I first arrived. Despite my exhaustion, I forced my feet to keep moving. Adrenaline pumped. If I could just find my car, maybe I could break into it, hotwire it, anything to get out of here. Then I spotted it, the faint reflection of metal headlights. My SUV, parked right where I left it. A surge of giddy relief hit me. I scrambled around to the driver's side, but it was locked, my keys still missing. With trembling hands, I hefted my hatchet, ready to smash the window. I paused. Something felt off. The reflection in the glass wasn't right. I could see my own muddy form, the flicker of distant fire in the background. But there was something else, a flash of red near my collar. Slowly, I looked down at my body. I wore a jacket, a tattered red coat, Lucien's coat. My breath hitched and fear coiled in my gut. I had no memory of putting it on. Had Lucien forced it on me? Or did I pick it up in my delirium? The coat's fabric clung to me like a second skin, faint sulfuric steam rising from the torn edges. I tried to shrug it off, but it was fused to the collar of my shirt, almost like it had grown onto my flesh. My head swam. Then a voice, half in my mind, half in the quiet air, whispered, "You've begun the song. You can't leave it half-written." "No," I croaked, panic surging. "No, this isn't happening. It's not real." But the coat felt all too real. I took a shaky breath, looked at the car window, and swung the hatchet. Glass shattered. Reaching inside, I unlocked the door. Slumping into the driver's seat, I jabbed a finger at the ignition. The keys were gone, of course. My reflection in the rearview mirror caught my eye, and my stomach lurched. My face was gaunt, hollow-cheeked, eyes bloodshot, and around my shoulders the red coat glimmered like an ember in the gloom. For a moment I swore I saw flickers of horns in the reflection, as though peeking out from under my hair. Blinking furiously, I checked again, and saw only me, worn and haggard, with the coat resting heavily on my shoulders. "You can't leave," the voice hissed. I fought it. I turned the key slot with the tip of the hatchet, praying some miracle would start the SUV. Nothing. My hands shook uncontrollably. Then, from outside, I heard footsteps. They were slow, scraping across the gravel. I froze. The door behind me was still open from my frantic entrance. The footsteps stopped right outside. My heart slammed in my chest. I twisted around. Only darkness beyond the open door, but I knew something stood there watching. My body trembled, and I realized I had no more strength to fight. Hatchet still in hand, I mustered a final burst of defiance. "Stay away!" I shouted at the shadow. The presence lingered, silent. Then, ever so softly, it retreated, footsteps fading. I slumped against the seat, panting. The coat's weight seemed to press into me. I realized I was probably losing my mind. Maybe I was possessed or cursed, or maybe Lucian had simply chosen me as his replacement. The final puzzle piece fell into place. Become me. Live forever. Or be forgotten like all the others. That was the bargain, wasn't it? I don't know how long I sat in that car, listening to my ragged breathing and the distant crackle of a dying fire. Minutes, hours, days. Time had no meaning anymore. At some point, dawn's light crept across the horizon, a pale glow illuminating the silent swamp. The place was unnervingly still, as though the entire world was holding its breath. Gathering what remained of my resolve, I crept out of the SUV. The coat clung to my shoulders, refusing to be removed. My hatchet felt like dead weight in my hand. I stared at the watery sunrise and realized the only choice left was to walk that gravel road out of here, if it truly led anywhere. The fiddler's shack was gone, Duke was gone, and my old life was in tatters. So I walked, step by painful step, half expecting the road to vanish or spin me in circles again. Instead, it kept going. The rising sun beat down, revealing the battered cypress around me. Mud clung to my clothes, dried blood stained my arms, and the red coat burned like a brand. After maybe an hour, the vegetation thinned. I reached a small intersection that, in normal times, would have connected to a more traveled highway. A battered old truck was parked there, and a lone ranger was standing by it, reading a map. The moment I stumbled out of the brush, he turned, startled. My heart pounded with relief. He called out, "Hey, buddy, you okay?" Tears welled in my eyes as I realized I was safe, or as close to safe as I could be. I reached him in a few shaky strides and all but collapsed. The ranger, a middle-aged man with a kind face, caught me under the arms. "Good Lord," he breathed. "You look like you've been through hell. Where'd you come from?" I tried to answer but only managed a hoarse whisper. He helped me into the passenger seat of his truck, gave me a water bottle. I gulped it down, a wave of dizziness nearly knocking me out. Through the haze, I heard him radio for help. I was faintly aware that he was eyeing the red coat clinging to me, but he said nothing about it. Finally, he asked, "Who are you? Where did you come from?" I forced out, "Mark Tilman. Was camping." He nodded, concerned. "It's a miracle I found you. A search team was going to head in after a report of a missing hiker. They said your car might be out this way." I stared at him blankly, trying to process. Had someone known? Reported me missing? The details didn't matter. All that mattered was I was out of the swamp. The ranger got behind the wheel and started the engine. As the truck pulled away from that intersection, I glanced in the side mirror. The reflection of the road behind us was clear. For a moment, I swore I saw movement among the cypress, like a figure in red holding a fiddle. Then it vanished. My heart hammered. I slumped back in the seat, hugging myself. The ranger looked over, eyes flicking to the coat again. "That's quite a jacket," he said softly. "Kind of old-fashioned, isn't it?" My hands gripped the collar. It was so tight, so hot against my skin. I tried to smile, but my face felt numb. My reflection in the side mirror caught my eye again. I saw the ragged features of a man on the brink, and around him that glaring red coat that refused to budge. A wave of dread spread through my chest, suffocating any sense of safety. I realized I might have escaped the swamp physically, but whatever I'd battled in that shack, I hadn't left it behind. The presence was inside me, or bound to me, or maybe I was becoming it. The devil's coat was a brand. A part of me realized I was just a shell, my soul burned away in the effort to fight. Could I remove the coat eventually? Could I burn it off? Would that even free me? Or was I damned to become the next Lucian, forever wandering the swamps, waiting to claim the next lost soul? The horizon blurred. The ranger drove us away from the Atchafalaya Basin, offering comforting words about hot meals and medical care. But I barely heard him over the pounding in my ears, because in the corner of my mind a quiet voice fiddled a tune, a slow, haunting melody that twisted my thoughts, and I knew there'd be no real escape, no final closure, only the creeping, inescapable dread that my story was far from over. My name is Marcus Lane. I'm 33 years old. This happened in August 2024, and I wish I could say I'm finally at peace with it. But the truth is, I still wake up in the middle of the night hearing the swamp waters sloshing around my feet, or Diesel barking for help from somewhere in the endless dark. I'm not a veteran or anything special. Before all this happened, I was just a freelance writer and amateur wildlife photographer who needed a break from the city grind. My plan was to spend a week in Honey Island Swamp near Pearl River in Louisiana. I wanted to film the wildlife, maybe snap some gorgeous photos for my blog. I even brought my 6-year-old German Shepherd, Diesel, because I thought it'd be a fun, if slightly rough, bonding experience for both of us. I never guessed the swamp would twist itself into something so unrecognizable, or that time itself would slip through my fingers like black water. I remember the day we arrived. It was scalding hot around 2 in the afternoon, and the humidity soaked right through my shirt the moment I stepped out of the car. Diesel panted by my side, tail wagging, as if to say, "Let's go, I'm ready." I had a canoe rented from a local who offered to drop me off near a secluded area. I should have realized something was off when my phone's GPS kept glitching during the drive. The screen flickered from 2:06 p.m. to 3:44 p.m. and back again. I thought it was a bug or poor reception. Honey Island Swamp is notoriously thick and tangled. Maybe cell signals just didn't penetrate well. I tossed my backpack, tent, camera equipment, and a small cooler into the canoe. The local caretaker, a wiry old man with a white beard and a name tag that read Mitch, helped me push off. As we shoved the canoe onto the water, he looked at me as if he wanted to say something but decided against it. There was a slight tremble in his hand, though I couldn't tell if it was age or anxiety. I thanked him, and he gave me a hollow nod. Diesel let out a brief, questioning bark. That was our final goodbye to any semblance of normalcy. The plan was simple. Paddle down a few inlets, find a decent patch of dry ground, set up camp, and spend the next few days exploring. I'd record the sounds of the swamp, take pictures of alligators, from a safe distance, of course, and gather material for a blog series I intended to call Wild Solitude. But Honey Island had a way of making you feel anything but solitary. The dense cypress trees, dripping with Spanish moss, clustered so tightly that patches of sky became scarce. The water was thick with algae, the air swarming with mosquitoes. Strange squeaks and croaks came from every direction, and sometimes I thought I heard voices just out of sight. 3 hours into paddling, I checked my phone. The battery was at 90% when we'd left, but it had dropped to 50. No big deal, I thought. Phones die quicker in the heat. I shrugged it off and used the screen to follow the downloaded map. Except the map didn't make sense. The lines indicating inlets didn't match what I saw around me. At one point, I was positive I'd followed the correct branch of the channel, but I ended up in a completely different area. Instead of open water and tall grass, I drifted into a labyrinth of cypress knees and thick lily pads. I wasn't terribly worried. Being a bit lost is half the adventure. Diesel, perched at the front of the canoe, kept his ears alert, occasionally letting out a low growl at something I couldn't see. By late afternoon, the humidity began to bear down on us, and I decided we'd better make camp. I spotted a small patch of relatively dry ground, large enough to pitch my tent. I pulled the canoe onto the bank and hammered a stake to keep it from drifting off. Mosquitoes assaulted us as we tried to set up the tent, but after an hour I managed to get the shelter upright. The sun was dipping low, painting the water an oily orange that slowly seeped into gray and then black. I got a campfire going just off the water line, small but serviceable, and fed Diesel a portion of his kibble. He wagged his tail with mild approval and curled near my feet. I remember sitting there, feeling exhausted but satisfied. The frogs and crickets sang all around. I fished out my phone, down to 20% battery. The time read 2:06 p.m. again, even though it was clearly after sunset. I tried restarting it, but it just froze on the same time. A spike of unease ran through me. Phones can glitch in weird ways, sure, but the hair on my arms stood up. I realized I had no signal, and the heat of the day lingered unnaturally, as if the swamp itself refused to cool down with the evening. I coaxed the fire to burn brighter, but for some reason, the flames kept guttering out as if suffocated by swamp humidity. Every time the fire died down, a wave of darkness rushed in, so total it felt like the world ended just beyond the flickering orange halo. Diesel shifted uneasily, ears twitching at distant splashes. I saw fleeting shapes in the corners of my eyes, but it might have been the reflection of cypress branches on the water. At least, that's what I told myself. Eventually, I crawled into my tent, Diesel by my side. I was too tired to do more than peel off my shoes. I zipped up my sleeping bag, put my phone on airplane mode to preserve the last scraps of battery, and tried to shut out the incessant hum of insects and the dripping water. I must have dozed off at some point. I woke with a start to a scraping noise, like somebody dragging a heavy sack across the ground outside. My eyes flew open. The tent was pitch black. I groped for my headlamp, heart pounding. Diesel was awake, ears perked, but surprisingly calm. The scraping sound faded into the swamp, replaced by a hush. Just as I convinced myself it was some raccoon or gator investigating the camp, I realized something else was wrong. I felt cold air directly against my feet. My sleeping bag was unzipped from the inside, and I didn't remember doing it. I twisted around, shining my headlamp in the cramped tent. Nothing out of place. Diesel blinked at me, his collar lightly jingling. Maybe I was half asleep and unzipped it myself, I thought. But the notion that I had no memory of it left me rattled. My watch read 1:02 a.m. Good enough for me. I laid back down, forcing my eyes shut, and tried to chase sleep again. When morning came, it was sudden. The sun hammered the tent fabric, turning the inside into a sauna. Diesel was already outside, nose to the ground, investigating. I yawned, crawled out, and immediately noticed the footprints near my extinguished campfire. Small, barefoot human prints. They looked fresh, pressed into the mud leading away from my camp. I stared at them, a jolt of fear tearing through my gut. Maybe there were locals or another camper wandering around, someone curious or messing with me. Either way, my heart hammered at the invasion of privacy. Someone must have been near my tent last night. I huffed, uncomfortably aware of how vulnerable I was. Diesel trotted over, sniffed the footprints, then barked twice. I followed them a few yards until they disappeared into swamp water. Shaken, I focused on chores. I tidied my campsite, rechecked the canoe, made some instant coffee with my portable stove. The water I collected from my canteen seemed slightly discolored, more yellow than usual. I boiled it anyway. The coffee turned out bitter, tasting of copper. My mouth felt dry even as I drank it. By late morning, I decided to explore a bit. If someone else was out here, maybe I'd find them and at least figure out who was skulking around my tent. With Diesel leading, we trudged through muddy trails and shallow water. I snapped a few photos of the cypress trees, occasionally hearing gators splash in the distance. We advanced deeper, the day heating up around us. I kept an eye on my compass, ignoring the phone entirely now. Its time read 2:06 p.m. perpetually. My watch said it was 10 a.m., so I relied on that. As I wove through the maze of cypress knees, the frogs and insects performed their raucous orchestration. The air was stifling, the humidity suffocating. I paused, wiped sweat from my forehead, and that's when I heard a human voice up ahead. Female. "It's so beautiful," she was saying in awestruck tones, followed by a soft laugh, "even though it smells like a grave." I eased forward and spotted her. A woman with short auburn hair wearing a lightweight button-down and cargo pants. She stood knee-deep in water, filming the cypress canopy with a small handheld camera. Diesel barked at her once. She turned quickly, startled, but then she gave me a broad, friendly smile. Her eyes were bright hazel, full of an infectious curiosity. "You scared me," she said, stepping out of the water. "I didn't think I'd run into anyone else out here. My name's Sarah Varnell." I introduced myself, relieved to encounter another person. She said she was a documentary filmmaker, traveling solo, capturing footage of local voodoo lore and swamp legends. We talked about how easily one could get lost in Honey Island. I mentioned my phone glitching. She frowned, saying her camera batteries were draining faster than normal, too. We made our way back to my campsite, and she accepted some of my trail mix, chewing thoughtfully. Something about her presence put me at ease. She was self-assured, obviously used to traveling alone. She had that vibe of someone who'd backpacked through rough places and knew how to keep calm. Yet, I couldn't shake the feeling that her words were carefully measured. Eventually, Sarah asked if I'd heard of an abandoned chapel in these parts. Supposedly, it was deep in the swamp, used decades ago by a cult that worshipped some preacher figure. She wanted to film it for her documentary. My rational side said that if such a place existed, it was probably dangerously unstable, half sunk in a bayou. But part of me was drawn to the mystery. She was excited at the idea, and I'll admit, it sounded like a good story for my blog. "I know it's somewhere east of here," she said, pointing deeper into the swamp. "Locals talk about a clearing where a congregation once lived off the land, like a commune, but more extreme. I'd really like to see if anything remains." Diesel was sniffing the air around Sarah, tail wagging uncertainly. For a moment, I thought he didn't quite trust her, but then he seemed to give up and lie down. Sarah wanted to leave right away, but we decided to wait until morning to search for the chapel. We were losing daylight fast, and neither of us wanted to get stranded. She offered to share her campsite with me or to stay here. Since I already had a decent setup, she opted to crash in her own tent a dozen yards away. I felt oddly relieved. Something in me balked at letting her too close. Maybe it was just me being paranoid, especially after the footprints near my fire. That night, it grew cold, which was odd because the swamp doesn't typically cool so quickly, even after sunset. I tried to keep a fire going, but it refused to stay lit, guttering out every few minutes, no matter how much dry kindling I used. Sarah stood near me, shining her flashlight around as if expecting to catch a glimpse of something lurking just outside the halo of light. At one point, I stepped away from the fire pit to retrieve my camera battery from the canoe. When I came back, Sarah wasn't alone. Diesel stood beside her, hackles raised, low growl reverberating from his chest. Sarah was whispering something to him, or maybe humming. I couldn't quite catch it. When she saw me, she stopped abruptly, gave me a faint smile, and said Diesel was restless. I tried to shrug it off, but it was unsettling. We both retreated to our tents eventually. The night passed in a swirl of half-sleep for me. A few times I woke up to hear Diesel pacing inside the tent, whining softly. Then, once, I thought I heard heavy footsteps outside. I unzipped the flap, heart hammering, but all I saw was black water reflecting starlight. No sign of Sarah's flashlight, no sign of anything. Morning dawned bright and punishingly hot. Dew dripped from my tent. Diesel's collar was damp, his fur sticky with swamp water. I realized I'd forgotten to zip the tent fully at some point. Diesel must have slipped out, or in sometime before sunrise. A swirl of uneasy questions churned in my head. I had no recollection of letting him out. I tried to shake it off and focus on the day's plan, find the chapel. I shouted Sarah's name, but there was no answer. When I went over to her campsite, I found her tent pitched neatly, unzipped, and empty. It looked untouched, except there was a thick layer of water puddled around the base, far more than what simple dew or rain could accumulate. I frowned, scanning the area. Her footprints led away from the camp, deeper into the swamp. I figured she had an early start. Diesel seemed anxious, but I grabbed my gear and followed her trail. I trudged for half an hour, the watery ground sloshing around my ankles. Then the trail vanished at a point where a stagnant pond stretched out. No sign of Sarah. Diesel sniffed the mud, let out a frustrated bark. I tried calling her name repeatedly, but the only response was the hollow echo of my own voice bouncing off cypress trunks. I decided she was probably exploring somewhere to get good footage. Still, a prickle of dread sank into my skin. Something about her silent departure felt wrong. Despite my worry, I tried to focus on my photography. For the next couple of hours, Diesel and I meandered through watery paths, scouring for gators, snapping pictures of egrets perched on low branches. The entire time, a sense of being watched nagged at me. The unrelenting heat pressed down, but the air carried a chill that occasionally brushed the back of my neck. I cursed under my breath about the warped sense of place. I might step past a cypress stump, swear I'd been there before, only to realize the path behind me had changed. I paused to check my watch. 10 a.m. We'd left camp around 8 a.m. I pulled out my phone. The battery read 10%. The clock stuck at 2:06 p.m. Furious, I turned it off completely to save what was left. That's when Diesel let out a series of frantic barks. He tore off through the undergrowth. I shouted for him, chasing after his wagging tail. He was fixated on something. Twigs and branches whipped my face as I sprinted to keep up. The watery ground splashed around my ankles, nearly tripping me. I finally skidded to a halt in a small clearing where Diesel stood stiff, staring at a figure crouched on a half-submerged log. At first, I thought it was an animal, but then it turned, a human figure in a filthy white robe. The robe was rotted at the edges, and the person's face was hidden under a hood. It scuttled backward across the log, face down, making an odd rasping sound. Diesel barked in alarm, but the figure slid into the water with barely a ripple and vanished among the lily pads. My breath caught in my throat. The stench of old rot hung in the air. I couldn't see anything else in the murky water. Then a whisper seemed to echo through the clearing. "It's not too late to be saved." I spun around, scanning every shadow. Nobody else was there. Diesel whined, his tail tucked between his legs. I stared at the water for a moment, half expecting the robed figure to pop back up, but all was still. I realized my legs were shaking. My mind struggled to rationalize. Maybe it was some local or a leftover from a weird religious group, but that voice, it sounded like it came from everywhere and nowhere. Disoriented, I decided to return to camp. Maybe Sarah had come back. I stumbled, tripping over cypress roots. Diesel barked, urging me along. The oppressive heat weighed on me, and I felt short of breath as if I'd been running for hours, though it was only a brisk walk. At times, I lost my bearings entirely. The environment seemed to warp around me. The same bent cypress trunk appeared more than once, though I was sure I hadn't gone in circles. After what felt like hours, I finally spotted my campsite. Relief washed over me, but it lasted only a second. Sarah was there, standing near my tent. Her clothes were dry, perfectly so, despite the sodden environment. She wasn't looking at me. She was looking at Diesel, her head tilted as if listening to something just out of earshot. "Sarah!" I shouted, stomping over. "I've been looking everywhere for you. Where the hell—" She turned slowly, her lips curving into a tight smile that seemed to stretch too far. Something about her posture was off, rigid, like she was fighting to stand upright. Her hazel eyes gleamed with an unnatural intensity. I was taken aback, but she acted like nothing was wrong. "Good morning," she said. "I just went for a walk. I found it." I blinked. "Found what?" "The chapel," she whispered, her voice trembling slightly. "There was a preacher there. He welcomed me. He said he'd been waiting." Then she let out a laugh that had no humor in it. "I think we should go tonight. You should be baptized, Marcus." A prickling sensation crawled up the back of my neck. My mind struggled to reconcile the calm, rational Sarah I'd met the day before with this zealous stranger. Diesel gave a low growl, but Sarah ignored him. She turned to rummage through her belongings, which now looked suspiciously clean. No mud or water stains, not even a smear of dirt. I felt dizzy. Something was terribly wrong. "What do you mean, baptized?" I asked, forcing a shaky laugh. "Sarah, are you feeling okay?" She paused, then faced me with a slow blink. "It's how we become free. You've felt it, haven't you? The way time doesn't move right here?" She reached for my wrist and tapped my watch. "That's the swamp, or something in it. The preacher says it's redemption, a second chance." I stumbled back a step, blood pounding in my ears. Diesel inserted himself between us, lip curled. The dryness of my mouth intensified. I fought a rising panic. "Sarah, this doesn't make sense. Let's pack up, and we'll head back to the caretaker's station. We can talk this out there." She gave me a slow, pitying smile. "If we leave now, we'll never find the truth." She walked away, heading toward her own tent. "I'm going to gather wood," she said over her shoulder, voice hollow. "We'll need a fire tonight." I wanted to stop her, but the fear of confrontation rooted me in place. Diesel whined at my side, ears flattened. We watched her vanish into the trees, her footsteps strangely silent. I paced the campsite, mind whirling. This was more than just dehydration or heat stroke. Something had changed her. What did she see out there? I popped open a bottle of water from my cooler. I took a big swig and spat it out. It tasted rancid, like old eggs. I rummaged through my supplies, frantic, and discovered all my food and water spoiled overnight, things that should have been sealed airtight. Even the packaged bars looked moldy. My stomach turned. That's when I noticed Diesel had wandered off. Panicked, I called his name. No response. My chest constricted. I'd lost him once earlier, and the memory still made me uneasy. I grabbed my flashlight even though it was still broad daylight. My gut told me day or night made no difference anymore. I followed the direction Diesel might have taken, shouting for him. My voice seemed to be swallowed by the swamp. A tension in the atmosphere grew, as if the air was thick with electricity. Then I heard the bark, faint and far away. I crashed through knee-deep water, nearly tripping over submerged logs. My eyes stung from salty sweat. After slogging through what felt like an endless stretch, I reached a small opening among the cypress. Diesel stood at the edge of a shallow pool, dripping wet, facing an old man in white robes. The man's hair was slicked back, and his face bore an unsettling composure. He looked at me with eyes that gleamed gold in the gloom. He called out in a voice that shouldn't have been so resonant in that quiet place. "Marcus Lane," he said calmly, as if greeting an old friend. "I've been expecting you." My stomach lurched. Diesel glanced back at me with flattened ears. The man stepped toward me, white robes trailing in the muck, yet somehow staying clean. A pungent, sickly, sweet smell wafted through the air. I wanted to shout or run, but my body tensed. He raised his hands in a conciliatory gesture, a kindly smile creasing his lips. "No need for fear," he said. "My name is Elijah. I tend souls here in this holy place." He flicked his gaze to Diesel, who seemed rooted in place, trembling. The old man turned that mesmerizing stare back to me. His voice was deep and gentle. "Your friend Sarah has already found the chapel. She's waiting for you." He spoke as if we were old acquaintances. Every syllable carried a subtle compulsion, like hearing a far-off choir. I swallowed hard, my mouth dry. "I don't know what you're talking about," I managed. "Why would Sarah—" He chuckled, and the sound was like scraping bones. "Sarah seeks truth, as do you. It's no accident you came here, Marcus. Honey Island reveals its secrets to those who are ready." I felt an odd wave of vertigo. The edges of my vision blurred. Did you see my dog earlier?" I asked, my voice shaking. "Did you do something to him?" He tilted his head. "Your companion is unharmed, but I see the doubt in your heart. Truth often brings fear, but come, let me show you." Before I could reply, Diesel snapped out of his paralysis. He lunged, barking furiously. Elijah took a single step back, not in fear, but in a disturbingly calm manner. Diesel bared his teeth, hackles raised, but something in the old man's presence prevented him from closing the distance. It was like Diesel was skidding on invisible ice, his claws scraping the ground but going nowhere. I seized the moment of confusion to grab Diesel's collar and yank him back. My heart thundered. Elijah's smile never wavered. He gave a small nod, then waded deeper into the pool, water lapping around his shins. His gaze lingered on me. "There's still time," he murmured. "Tonight, we hold sermon, baptism. Those who partake will be saved, those who do not." His voice dropped to a whisper. "Time will swallow them." I blinked, and in that fraction of a second he was gone. The water rippled gently where he stood, but there was no sign of him. Diesel whined in confusion. I felt a wave of nausea and panic grip me. We turned and bolted back toward camp, driven by adrenaline and pure terror. The notion that I might be hallucinating flitted across my mind, but the wetness of Diesel's fur, the pounding in my chest, the stench of rotting vegetation, all of it was too vivid. We made it back to the campsite in a full sprint, my lungs on fire. I collapsed near the tent, Diesel panting heavily. Every nerve in my body demanded I pack up and get out now. No blog was worth this. But was it even possible to find my way back? My sense of direction had betrayed me repeatedly, and my phone was useless. As I scrambled to gather gear, I caught a glimpse of something by the tree line. My entire body jerked as I recognized Sarah standing there, arms limp at her sides. She tilted her head, watching me calmly, then gestured for me to follow her. Every instinct screamed not to, but she was the only other living person I'd met. Perhaps she could still be reasoned with. I shoved a few essentials into my backpack. My camera, a small hunting knife, flashlight, and some half-usable supplies. I'd all but given up on the rotted food. Keeping Diesel on a short lead, I approached Sarah slowly. She stared through me with an unsettling emptiness. In the daylight, her eyes seemed unnaturally bright. "Sarah, we need to leave," I said firmly. "Whatever's going on with this Elijah or chapel, it's not safe." She blinked once, then turned without a word. Walking deeper into the swamp, it wasn't exactly an answer, but I followed, hoping to talk sense into her. Maybe she could lead me back to a boat launch. I tossed a glance over my shoulder at my campsite, wishing I'd never stepped foot in Honey Island. Sarah led us on a winding path deeper and deeper into the watery labyrinth. Twice I tried to speak, but she'd hush me with a finger to her lips. She navigated the cypress knees and rotting logs with uncanny ease, as if she'd walked this route 100 times. Meanwhile, I slipped and stumbled, Diesel letting out nervous yips. The air seemed cooler now, the sunlight muted despite it being midday. We eventually stepped into a clearing overshadowed by towering cypress trees draped in moss. At the center, I saw it. An old wooden building, half sunk in water, its walls green with algae and decay. It looked like a small church or chapel, leaning precariously to one side. The half-collapsed steeple was crowned with a rusted iron cross. "Is this the chapel?" I asked, my voice low. Sarah nodded slowly, eyes fixed on the sagging doorway. "He's inside," she whispered. I took a cautious step closer. The odor of mildew and rot was overwhelming. The water around the chapel was black, swirling with oily reflections. My stomach churned as I recalled Elijah's promise of a sermon. Was that scheduled for tonight? Before I could say anything else, Sarah waded forward, water up to her thighs. Diesel barked wildly, resisting my attempts to calm him. Then, without warning, the dog tore the leash from my grip and sprinted away into the swamp. He darted around the chapel, disappearing behind tangled cypress roots. "Diesel!" I shouted, adrenaline spiking. I started to chase after him, but Sarah's voice stopped me cold. "I wouldn't do that," she said, strangely calm. "He'll come back when it's time." She looked at me, and for the first time, her eyes showed a flicker of something like sadness. "If he can." A wave of fury and fear shot through me. "What do you mean, if he can?" I demanded. "What's happening here, Sarah?" She gave no answer. Instead, she turned and walked into the chapel's dark doorway. The rotted floorboards groaned under her weight. I hesitated. Part of me screamed, "Don't go in," but my brain also insisted we might find answers. Gritting my teeth, I followed, shining my flashlight ahead. Inside, the chapel smelled even worse, like old sewage and soaked leather. Rows of pews were submerged nearly to the seat level. Water dripped from the beams. I thought I heard faint chanting from deeper within, though the place seemed empty aside from me and Sarah. She continued her silent march, leading me to a raised area that might have once been the altar. The water was slightly shallower there. Muck swirled around my boots. At the front, a large wooden pulpit still stood upright, though warped by damp rot. Flickering lanterns, impossibly bright, hung along the walls, giving off a ghastly white glow. I had no idea how they were lit, no electricity out here. The flicker had an unnatural quality, like dozens of tiny eyes watching me. In the center of the dais was a hole in the floor, where black swamp water gurgled up, forming a kind of pool. Sarah stopped beside it. She looked at me, tears pooling in her eyes. Her voice trembled. "He baptized me here. I saw things. Felt time unravel. You can't fight it, Marcus. You have to join us." My skin crawled. "Sarah, you're not making sense," I hissed. "This place is rotten. You need help." She shook her head. "You can't understand until you submit. It's bigger than either of us. This swamp, it's not just land. It's alive with him. He's in the roots, the water, the—" Her words broke off. Her eyes rolled back in her head. She let out a gasp that turned into a guttural scream. I lurched backward, nearly falling into the water. Her body shook as if seizing, arms rigid at her sides. Then her voice deepened into something that wasn't hers. "Marcus," she hissed, though her lips barely moved. "You've come so far just to run away?" She stepped closer, and I realized she was no longer Sarah, not in any sense. She was a puppet with that thing speaking through her. I raised my flashlight in a futile defensive gesture. "Elijah," I whispered. My mind reeled. "You. Leave her alone." The possessed Sarah cackled, her mouth opening wider than it should. She gave herself willingly. She thirsted for knowledge. Now she is part of me, and I am part of her, but you still doubt. Her left arm snapped up, faster than I could react, grabbing my wrist in an iron grip. Panic coursed through me. Then, abruptly, she released me and pointed to the watery pit beneath the pulpit. "Look," came the low voice. I couldn't stop myself. My gaze dropped to the black pool, which seemed to swirl of its own accord. In that swirling reflection, I thought I saw shapes. People in white robes, half decayed, kneeling in prayer. I saw Diesel, limp and gasping for air as if drowning. I saw myself, hunched over, eyes hollow, mouth chanting. My name is Jake Whitmore. I'm 33 years old. This happened in October of 2023 during a week-long trip I took into the Kisatchie National Forest. I've spent countless days wrestling with my sanity since then, wondering if any of what I experienced can ever be explained by logic. Maybe you'll believe me, maybe not, but I'm going to tell you every detail as faithfully as I can. I decided to get away because my life was unraveling. I was recently divorced, stuck in a job that felt meaningless, and I realized I'd almost forgotten how to breathe. My dog, Diesel, a black lab I rescued a few years ago, was the only creature on the planet I trusted. So I planned an escape, a remote campsite by a place called Black Lake, deep in the Kisatchie National Forest in Louisiana. My plan was simple: spend a week off the grid, find some peace and quiet, and maybe come back with a clearer head. Black Lake wasn't on most official maps. An older co-worker who grew up in the region told me there was a place in the far north corner of Kisatchie everyone called Black Lake. He swore up and down it existed, said it was basically a wide portion of a bayou that looked dark from the cypress canopy overhead. However, when I searched it on any standard hiking or fishing guide, I found almost nothing. A blurry topographic map from some old forum was all I had. It showed a roughly round body of water surrounded by dense forest, accessible by a few old logging roads. I printed that out, loaded up on supplies, and set out around the first week of October. The drive took me longer than expected. Much of the route was well maintained until I took a small dirt turnoff where the road sign had been half knocked over. Diesel whined in the passenger seat, alternating between sticking his head out the window and curling up to sleep. The forest thickened, the dirt road bouncing my old pickup, and I started feeling a strange excitement building in my chest. By the time I reached what looked like the campsite, just a small clearing near a bank that could have been a lake, the sun was edging down behind the trees. The water was dark, a mirror that reflected the cypress and Spanish moss. I exhaled slowly, feeling a sense of relief. This was exactly the kind of solitude I needed. I pitched my tent near the shore, hammered the stakes, and spread out Diesel's little blanket inside. While Diesel explored, sniffing every log and root, I tested my phone. There was no service, not shocking. I also had a handheld GPS, but it was acting glitchy, stuck on a loading screen. I set it aside, figuring the old topographic map plus my compass would suffice. Diesel came bounding back, tail wagging, so I fed him dinner, then opened a can of chili for myself. Night draped the lake quickly. The water almost looked black under a sky thick with stars. I built a small campfire, Diesel curled up by my feet, and I felt myself breathing easier than I had in months. By the time I crawled into my tent, I was just grateful for the stillness. I woke to a quiet dawn, the water so calm it was like tinted glass. Diesel seemed a little antsy, but I assumed he was just excited to explore. I brewed coffee over the campfire, filled my thermos, and decided to paddle around the shore in the cheap inflatable kayak I'd brought. Before I left, I put Diesel on a tether so he wouldn't wander too far, double-checked I had enough water, and set off. I never made it more than a few hundred yards along the shoreline because after about 10 minutes, the wind kicked up, stirring the mirror-like surface into choppy waves. I got this odd impression that something beneath the water was watching me. That's normal, I told myself. You're just not used to being so remote. I paddled back. Diesel was barking with high-pitched concern when I landed. As soon as I set foot on the bank, he pressed himself against my leg. I patted his head to calm him. That afternoon, I set out with Diesel to check out the surrounding trails. The old topographic map indicated a small ridge and a series of footpaths heading around Black Lake. But as we walked, the path didn't match the lines on the page. In fact, it looked like the lake was turning in directions that shouldn't exist. Diesel kept pausing and sniffing the air, ears back. I spotted footprints by the water. Several sets, maybe a day old. Some were boots, some looked like sneakers, and there was at least one set that looked small, like a kid's footprints. Surprised, I crouched to examine them. A child out here? That gave me pause. This place was so isolated, hardly on the map at all. Still, maybe they came with parents or older siblings. It was odd, but not impossible. We followed the lakeside trail for a while, but the sky began to dim far too quickly. I glanced at my watch. It was barely 3 p.m., yet the sunlight felt more like late afternoon. Clouds overhead thickened. Diesel tugged at the leash, whining, so I decided to head back to camp. We got lost once or twice on the return, though I'd taken care to note landmarks. The trees seemed to shift, or maybe it was my nerves messing with me. By the time we made it back, the sun was low, and the entire lake was saturated in that half-light that makes everything look underexposed. The next morning, I got the unexpected shock of hearing voices near my campsite. 2 other people were about 30 yards away, rummaging through a pack. Diesel barked, and I called out a greeting. They turned, startled. A young woman with dark hair and a ponytail and a tall man with a red baseball cap. She introduced herself as Rachel Henders, a grad student from Baton Rouge. The tall man, she said, was her fiancé, Nathan, but he was only visiting for a day or 2. She'd been out there studying water quality for her graduate research, or so she said. They looked suspicious at first, probably because they weren't expecting to see anyone else. But I managed a few polite jokes, and soon we were chatting. It was almost a relief to encounter other people in such a secluded area. Rachel told me she planned to collect samples from the lake's perimeter for a few more days. Nathan explained he had a job in the city, couldn't stay long, but wanted to enjoy a bit of rustic camping with his fiancée. I introduced Diesel, who took to Rachel immediately but seemed standoffish with Nathan. Not all dogs like everyone, but I noticed Diesel's hackles raise whenever Nathan came close. I apologized, and Nathan shrugged, though I caught a flicker of annoyance. They had a basic camp a little ways down the bank. Rachel asked if I'd heard or seen anything strange, things like lights or weird noises at night. I said not really, besides the fact the place felt bigger than the map suggested. She nodded and said she'd noticed odd readings with her equipment, weird anomalies in the pH levels, or random temperature shifts in the water. "There's something about this lake," she murmured, as if that explained everything. Nathan mostly talked about fishing. He wanted to find a decent spot to catch bass. I warned him my luck had been zero so far. Might be the time of year, he speculated. Eventually, they headed off to their own camp. I was grateful for the brief conversation, though Diesel seemed uneasy for the rest of the morning. That night, everything started going very wrong. I built my usual campfire, rummaged out a can of stew, and fed Diesel. The night was weirdly quiet. No frogs, no insects. I didn't hear a single chirp. Around 9, the temperature dropped. I watched the flames shift from orange to a strange pale blue. For a moment, I honestly thought it was just a chemical in the wood. Then Diesel barked at it, whining and pacing. I tossed on more kindling, trying to get it to burn normally, but the flames flickered blue again, and then greenish. It reminded me of a cheap fireworks display. Eventually, the colors died down, and the fire returned to normal. I tried to sleep, but woke up multiple times to the sense that someone was unzipping my tent. Each time I sat up, brandishing my flashlight, there was no one there. By dawn, I felt groggy, like I'd barely slept an hour. Diesel was nowhere to be found. I panicked, calling his name. It took me 20 minutes of frantic searching before I found him about 100 yards into the woods, staring at something pinned to a tree trunk. It was a ragged piece of cloth, gray, muddy, possibly part of a shirt. Diesel growled as I pulled him back by the collar. Right then, a voice startled me. "Did your dog find something?" I turned to see Rachel, minus Nathan. She looked concerned, eyes ringed with exhaustion. She confessed she'd been hearing footsteps in the night, circling her tent. Nathan had apparently gone to gather more firewood early that morning, but hadn't returned yet. We decided to try to locate him together. As we walked, Rachel mentioned that her phone and GPS had died hours earlier, even though she'd charged them in her car's battery the day before. I confessed my GPS was also acting up, and that my phone signal was gone. She shook her head. "Everything's going wrong," she murmured. "The data I've collected makes no sense either." We followed a path that was supposed to loop around the lake. That's when I noticed something very, very off. The sun. I kept glancing up, expecting it to be midday, but it seemed stuck at a low angle, as if morning refused to end. My watch read 10 a.m., but the shadows were too long. It created a sense of disorientation that made my stomach turn. Rachel said it was messing with her too. We found Nathan's footprints along a muddy stretch of bank. We followed them for a bit, but they vanished near a rocky area. At that point, Diesel started barking wildly. A small shape stepped out from behind a cypress stump. It was a boy, maybe 7, 8 years old, barefoot, wearing dirty overalls that looked several sizes too big. He had short curly hair, caked with mud. "Hey there," Rachel said softly. "Are you lost?" He just stared. His eyes were an odd shade of gray, like he lacked pupils. Diesel growled, pulling hard on his leash. My heart beat faster. The kid's lips parted in a grin that seemed to stretch too far. "Mama's bones," he said in a hoarse whisper. "I need help finding my mama's bones." Rachel and I exchanged glances. I asked him where his parents were, but he just repeated, "I need help," over and over. He reeked of stagnant water. Rachel tried to approach him, but he stepped backward so swiftly it was like he glided on the ground, and then he bolted into the thicket. Diesel tried to chase, but I held tight to the leash, certain we'd only scare the kid more. That was the first time I felt a real wave of dread, the kind that sinks into your stomach and doesn't let go. An hour or two of searching the area yielded no sign of Nathan or the boy. Exhausted, we decided to return to Rachel's camp to see if Nathan had come back on his own. We found footprints again near the water, a single set leading inland, but we couldn't decide if they were Nathan's or the kids'. When we got to Rachel's site, there was no Nathan, but everything looked ransacked. Her tent's zipper shredded, her sleeping bag unrolled and lying in the dirt, her cooler open and water bottles missing. She cursed under her breath. At least her small car was still there. She tried starting it, but the engine gave only a short sputter. "Damn battery," she said, but her eyes flickered with unease. We decided to go back to my camp, maybe regroup and plan. My truck was older, but might still start, we hoped. On the hike, we both noticed the environment felt subtly changed. Certain logs or stumps we passed seemed rearranged, as if the forest itself was shifting. When we finally reached my campsite, we found a new horror. The sleeping bag I'd left neatly rolled in my tent was laid out on the ground, unzipped from the inside, stuffed with black hair. It looked like clumps of algae or fur matted together. My spare clothes from the truck bed had been dragged out, scattered around the campsite. I ran to my pickup, heart pounding. The driver's side door was open, though I was sure I'd locked it. The battery was drained dead, nothing turned over. "This can't be happening," Rachel said, voice trembling, almost more angry than scared. We spent the rest of that day trying to figure out a plan. We decided to ration the supplies we did have left, mostly freeze-dried meals, a few water jugs, and some snacks. But to our shock, half the food had gone moldy overnight. Sacks of trail mix were riddled with tiny worms. My bottled water smelled foul, even though it had been sealed. All the while, Diesel wouldn't stop pacing, whining. It was as if the dog was trying to warn us of something we couldn't see. As evening came, we got a small fire going again. Diesel refused to settle. Rachel sat on a log, staring into the flames, hugging her knees. She said she felt dizzy, that the sun shouldn't have set so soon. I checked my watch, 6 p.m., but the sky was nearly black. My mind reeled with fear and confusion, a sense of reality slipping away. We talked about leaving on foot, but the roads were miles away, and we didn't know if we'd just get lost wandering in circles. Our best hope seemed to be that Nathan would reappear, or that we'd find enough daylight to navigate out. "We should keep watch tonight," I suggested. "You rest first. I'll stay awake until midnight." Rachel nodded. "I feel like if I close my eyes I'll lose myself," she whispered, "but I'm so tired." She crawled into my tent near Diesel, who curled protectively at her side. I sat by the fire replaying every moment that had led me here. I tried not to blame myself for coming to such an isolated spot, but anger and regret gnawed at me. Sometime around 10, according to my watch, a rustling drew my attention. I flicked on my flashlight and aimed it at the edge of the clearing. Someone stepped into the light. It was Nathan. "Thank God," I breathed, running over. "Where have you been? Rachel's been worried sick." He stood there, half soaked, dark hair matted to his forehead. He wore his red baseball cap backward, and his clothes were covered in mud. But he stared right past me. His eyes looked off, almost glassy. In the firelight, I noticed his fingernails were torn or missing. Dark, dried blood clung to his fingers. "Are you all right?" I asked, thoroughly alarmed. "Nathan?" He slowly turned his gaze to me, then formed a grin that lasted a bit too long. "I found the wood," he said. What?" He pointed to a small bundle of twigs in his left hand. They were hardly enough to fuel a fire for 20 minutes. Diesel poked his head out of the tent and immediately started snarling, a low, menacing rumble I'd never heard him make. He advanced, teeth bared. Nathan's grin remained fixed. He stared down at Diesel as if in wonder. Then he dropped the twigs and took a step forward. Diesel lunged, barking viciously. "Back off," I shouted. though I wasn't sure if I was yelling at Diesel or Nathan. Nathan just tilted his head. "She's in the water," he said, voice low. "Rachel, she's in the water." My stomach twisted. "She's sleeping right—" I turned to point at the tent, my words choking in my throat. The tent was unzipped, empty. Rachel was gone. Diesel was alone inside, hackles raised, barking at Nathan. I spun back. "Where is she?" He shrugged. "Don't you hear her singing?" All I heard was Diesel barking. I yelled for Rachel, shining my flashlight around. My heart hammered. There were footprints near the tent, fresh in the soft soil. Some looked like boots. Nathan's maybe, others were bare. The footprints led off toward the lake. I grabbed my flashlight, hollering Rachel's name. Nathan caught my arm with a tight grip. "Don't you trust me, Jake?" he asked, blinking too little. That same elongated grin plastered to his face. Then Diesel sank his teeth into Nathan's leg, and Nathan let out a pained howl. I took the chance to jerk free, stumbling forward, calling for Rachel again. Diesel didn't let go. The dog growled. Teeth clamped on Nathan's calf. Blood trickled down Nathan's leg. Yet Nathan barely reacted. He pried Diesel's jaws open with surprising strength, his expression shifting to something like cold curiosity. Diesel yelped. Nathan hurled the dog aside and Diesel landed in the dirt, whimpering. Rage and fear flared inside me, but before I could react, Nathan was gone. He just sprinted into the shadows. I rushed to Diesel, checking him for serious wounds. He was limping, but otherwise conscious. My whole body trembled with adrenaline. "Rachel!" I kept yelling, as if my voice could somehow break through the night. We searched for hours by flashlight, following footprints and broken branches. The trail led us near the water, where I found Rachel's canteen floating, half filled with muddy water. No sign of her. The footprints ended in a patch of reeds. I waded up to my knees, scanning the darkness with my flashlight, calling her name until my voice was raw. Diesel barked at the reeds, but wouldn't go further. Sometime around the point my watch read 3 a.m, I gave up. Exhausted, I stumbled back to the campsite. Diesel limped behind me. My mind spun with the possibility that Nathan had drowned Rachel, or that she might have wandered off in a daze. But there was that terrifying chance it wasn't Nathan at all. Some ghost, or demon, or whatever form had taken his shape. Tears stung my eyes, but I forced them down. I couldn't help her if I lost my head. I told myself I just needed a short rest to gather my strength and search again at first light. Then I realized, what did first light even mean here? Time was folding in on itself, the sun rising and setting on some unnatural schedule. I found a spot near the remains of my fire, Diesel at my side. My thoughts churned until exhaustion overtook me. When I opened my eyes, it was bright out. I had no idea how long I'd slept. My watch claimed it was almost noon. Diesel whined and nudged my arm. I sat up, and that's when I noticed the stench. It was like rotting meat. My stomach flipped. I surveyed the campsite. Our supplies, food, water, every container was covered in gray fuzz, as if it had been left out for weeks. It made no sense. Some of that food had been freeze-dried pouches, good for years, yet now they were spoiled in a single night. I went to the lake's edge to rinse my face, trying to think logically. I'd just come around a bend in the shoreline when I spotted something lodged against the roots of a cypress tree. At first, I thought it was driftwood. Then I saw the shape of an arm. My blood turned to ice. It was Rachel. Her body was half submerged. She wore her hiking pants and a water-stained t-shirt. Her dark hair floated around her head, tangled in moss. Her arms were pinned under a gnarled root, as though the tree had grown around her. The worst was her face. Her eyes were gone, and her mouth was crammed with mud and leaves, as if forced down her throat. I recoiled, tripping over my feet. Diesel let out a pitiful whine. Panic hammered my brain. I wanted to scream, to be sick, to call for help, but my voice wouldn't come out. My hands were shaking so badly I nearly dropped the flashlight I was still gripping. I forced myself to approach her body. The water was shallow. A swarm of flies buzzed as I carefully moved her hair aside, praying I might see some sign of life. But her body was cold. Her fingernails were torn away, leaving raw, bloody beds. I tasted bile in my throat. This was real death, savage and cruel. I thought of her last words to me, how she worried about footsteps in the dark. I whispered a shaky apology. Diesel barked behind me, pressing close to my leg as if to say we needed to leave now. He was right, but I hesitated, unsure what to do next. Part of me wanted to free her from the tree's roots, bring her to shore, but I was petrified. Another part of me, maybe the practical side, knew there was no help out here. If I took her body out, I'd have to carry it who knows how far. She felt almost fused to the cypress, like the forest itself had grown around her in the night. Eventually, I staggered back to the campsite, my eyes burning with tears. My mind reeled at the possibility that Nathan had done that to her, or that thing wearing Nathan's shape. Diesel whined in sympathy, but also kept glancing at the tree line. My survival instincts kicked in. I needed to get out of there. My phone was useless. The vehicles had dead batteries, the supplies were rotting. That left one option: trek out on foot. But the next problem, I wasn't entirely sure where to go. The roads were miles away, and the path was disorienting. If time was truly out of joint, or if the forest was shifting, how could I trust my compass and map? Still, staying put felt like a death sentence. I grabbed what little was salvageable: some matches, a flare gun with one remaining shot, a canteen that didn't smell too bad, and tried to feed Diesel. He refused to eat. That worried me, but I couldn't blame him. We set off, me picking a direction I believed would lead us to the old logging road. The deeper we went, the more everything felt oppressive. Strange shapes flickered in the corner of my vision. The trees seemed to loom, twisting overhead, as though the forest was breathing. Diesel kept his nose low, occasionally stopping to whine at something I couldn't see. Midway through the afternoon, assuming my watch told any semblance of truth, we discovered an old metal sign half buried in leaves. The paint was chipped, but I saw the faint words: Forest Service ARD. Relief flashed in my chest. If I followed that route, maybe we'd find a bigger road eventually. I pressed on. The day passed in a blur. The sun started to descend again, or possibly the thick canopy just made it seem that way. My body ached, and Diesel was limping from the earlier scuffle. Eventually, I found a shallow ravine with a trickle of water. Deciding we both needed rest, I stopped there to make a small fire. I tried not to dwell on the fact that I'd left Rachel's body behind. A swirl of guilt and revulsion churned in my gut. My thoughts reeled with the nightmares of her empty eyes. This place wasn't natural. It consumed everything. As darkness returned, maybe the same day, maybe not, I fed a few branches into the fire. Diesel lay on his side, muzzle between his paws, tail still. The flames started to flicker the same eerie blue color. My heart pounded. I stood, shining my flashlight around. The forest was silent, the hush of predators that indicate something bigger is around. Then I heard footsteps. A slow, dragging sound, as if someone was pulling a heavy weight. My throat went dry. Diesel's ears perked, and he let out a half-bark, half-whine. "Nathan?" I called, though terror twisted my voice. A shape lurched out of the darkness, arms slack at its sides. It was Nathan, yes, but the light revealed what he'd become. His hair was plastered to his scalp with mud, his skin pale, lips cracked and dried. He limped, and every so often, he let out a wet cough. When he got closer, I saw his eyes were fogged over, the way a fish's eyes look after it's been left out too long. Blood caked his torn fingernails. He reached a trembling hand toward me. "Jake," he said, in a voice that sounded watery, "you found me." I grabbed a burning stick from the fire, brandishing it. "Stay back." Diesel bared his teeth, but I could feel him trembling. Nathan tried to smile, but it looked wrong, unnatural. "It's not my fault," he whispered. "She wanted to stay." My stomach churned. You killed Rachel. You killed your own fiancée." Nathan shook his head in slow, deliberate arcs. "She's part of the trees. She's with the lake, Jake. I just showed her the way. Micah said it was necessary." My mind reeled. That name, Micah, the boy we'd seen. That child. What is he? Nathan's face twitched, the corners of his mouth rising in that perpetual grin. "He's older than the forest," he said simply. I wanted to run, but I couldn't leave the meager fire or Diesel. I still gripped the burning stick. "Don't come closer," I warned again, but he took another step. Something squirmed beneath the skin of his throat, a writhing bulge that made me gag. He coughed, and brackish water dribbled out of his mouth. Then, in a burst of movement, he lunged at me with a glinting blade in his hand. A hunting knife. I tried to dodge, but his speed was uncanny, especially for someone who looked half dead. The blade slashed across my forearm. I yelped, stumbling backward. Diesel barked and jumped forward, teeth bared, but Nathan kicked the dog aside with monstrous strength. Diesel cried out. Fueled by a mix of rage and terror, I jabbed the burning stick at Nathan's face. It connected with his cheek, searing flesh. He screamed, staggering back. That gave me a second to pivot, grab Diesel's collar, and pull him toward the darkness away from the fire. My plan was to circle around and maybe come at Nathan from behind. But then I saw him straighten up, the burn on his face already bubbling in a disgusting mass, as though infection raced across his skin. He pressed a hand to his blistering cheek and coughed again, spitting dark liquid. "We'll all be part of the lake soon," he rasped. "You can't fight it." My heart hammered. I felt my legs wanting to collapse. Instead, I forced myself to keep moving, quickly grabbing the flare gun from my belt. I had one shot. I aimed at Nathan's chest. He paused, eyes flickering with an almost childlike fear. "Jake!" I pulled the trigger. The flare erupted, slamming into him. A burst of red light exploded against his torso. He let out a mangled cry, dropping to his knees, the flare sizzling in his flesh, sparks and smoke rising. I seized the moment to grab Diesel and run. We tore through the woods. I didn't care which direction, just away from that monstrous thing. I still heard his screams echo through the trees, but after a few minutes of sprinting, everything went silent again, except for my ragged breathing and Diesel's frantic panting. We stumbled until we found a fallen log. My lungs burned, my body was drenched in cold sweat. I sank down, sobbing in relief that we'd escaped. Diesel licked my face, whining. He was limping badly, but at least he was alive. I clutched him, tears streaming down my cheeks, no words left in me. We spent hours or days wandering. I lost all sense of time. My watch might have read 4 a.m., but the sky looked like mid-afternoon. Or it could have been that the sun refused to come up. At one point, the forest opened to a wide clearing. We found ourselves near a bank that looked suspiciously like Black Lake again. It was as if the land was playing tricks on us, spinning us around. I recognized a half-submerged log with the same twisted shape I'd seen near my first campsite. Rage flooded me. I'd been walking in circles. Or maybe the place was rearranging itself to trap me. At that moment, I caught sight of movement on the opposite shore. A small figure stepping lightly between the cypress knees. Micah. He was staring at me across the water. Even from a distance, I could sense his grin. Diesel barked weakly, but he didn't try to chase. I knelt, trembling, the hair on my arms standing on end. The boy raised his hand, beckoning. I glanced at the water, swirling dark and silent. It felt as if everything in the forest was collectively holding its breath. I wanted to scream at him to stay away. Instead, I forced myself to slip back into the cover of the trees. That's when I noticed footprints in the dirt. My footprints. They were fresh. I recognized the pattern of my boots. And they were next to smaller prints, like a child's bare feet. My mind threatened to unravel. I got the sense I was being stalked, cornered, toyed with. Exhausted, filthy, and half-starved, I decided the only real hope left was to do something drastic. Burn everything. Maybe, if I destroyed the campsite or started a big enough fire, it would break this cycle. So, we returned once more to the clearing where my truck was, or should have been. I had to rely on the map and guesswork. Miraculously, we made it back just as twilight, or dawn, tinted the sky purple. My truck was still there, but the tires were flat, the paint scratched. My tent, sleeping bag, and every supply was scattered. Animals, or something else, had shredded it all. I don't know what came over me, but I started gathering the scraps into a pile, along with dry tinder. I even siphoned the last bit of gas from the truck's tank into a plastic jug. Diesel lay next to me, panting heavily, watching as I poured gasoline on the heap. My heart pounded with adrenaline. I still had a lighter in my jacket pocket. I flicked it. A tall whoosh of fire erupted, sending sparks high. The flames caught on the gear, the old tent, and the underbrush. For a second, I felt a surge of triumph, like I'd struck back. If the forest was alive in some evil way, maybe that fire would force it to let me go. The flames roared, crackling fiercely. I looked around, half expecting an army of twisted silhouettes to swarm me. Instead, I heard a shriek resonate through the trees. The voice was high-pitched, like a child's. Diesel barked. I saw a figure at the edge of the woods, Micah. He stood there, his face contorted in anger or fear, mouth open too wide. Then he bolted away. Maybe my theory was right. The demon child or spirit was being driven out by the fire. I fed the blaze more kindling, stoking it until it grew dangerously large. Then Diesel let out a bark that sounded different from any I'd heard before. Terrified. I spun around to see that the forest behind me was literally shaking, branches swaying as though battered by storm winds. Yet the air was dead still. The shriek returned, an unearthly cry that vibrated in my chest. The ground under my feet felt unstable, but I stood my ground, arms raised to shield against the heat of the flames. "Stay back," I shouted, unsure to whom. "Leave us alone." Moments later, something stumbled into the flickering light. I recognized the silhouette. Nathan. His clothes were charred, half his torso blackened from the flare gun's impact. His skin glistened with open burns, watery fluid seeping from the wounds. He staggered forward, watery eyes fixed on me. "Why?" he croaked. "Why'd you do it, Jake?" I recoiled in horror. The man was half dead. He took another unsteady step. "You burned me," he said, almost childlike in tone. Then his face contorted in rage. "You think that'll stop us?" I clenched my fists, stepping back to keep the flames between us. "Stay away," I said again, but my voice trembled. Diesel snarled, but he was exhausted, injured. If Nathan was still animated, it meant something else was moving him, something that didn't care about mortal wounds. Nathan's lips peeled back, revealing blackened gums. "She's waiting for you, in the trees." My stomach twisted at the mention of Rachel. "You murdered her, you twisted monster." He chuckled, a wet, rasping laugh. "I was chosen," he hissed. "Micah guides me. The lake claims us all." That's when Diesel lunged, ignoring his pain. Throwing himself at Nathan's side, they both toppled. Nathan let out a roar. Diesel clamped down on his forearm, teeth sinking deep. For a moment I thought Diesel would tear his arm off. But Nathan slammed a fist into Diesel's shoulder, forcing him to release. Diesel yelped, and Nathan twisted onto his knees, knife in hand again. Time slowed. I saw the blade descending towards Diesel. I hurled myself forward, tackling Nathan with every ounce of strength I had left. We rolled on the ground, perilously close to the raging fire. The heat seared my skin. I gripped Nathan's wrist, trying to wrest the knife away. He spat at me, that watery, foul liquid spattering my face. My eyes burned. Diesel barked, limping around us, trying to find an opening. I managed to slam Nathan's hand against a rock, knocking the blade loose. Grabbing the hot remains of a tent pole from the burning pile, I wielded it like a spear. Nathan let out a guttural shriek. I rammed the sizzling metal into his chest. It went in deeper than I expected. A sickening crunch. He convulsed, watery blood spurting. For a moment, I thought I saw something black and worm-like slithering under his skin, then the flames leapt higher, and I lost sight of it. Nathan tried to speak, but only managed a wet gargle. He pitched forward, collapsing, pinned by the pole. A sudden hush fell, broken only by the crackling of the bonfire. My chest heaved, and a wave of nausea churned in me. Had I killed him, or was he already dead? Diesel limped over, sniffing Nathan's body. He whined, then looked at me as if to say we had to go. But the sight of that black ooze seeping from Nathan's wounds made me want to destroy it completely. I kicked more flaming debris onto him, half expecting him to start screaming again. He didn't move. The stench of burning flesh and moldy water filled the air, vile enough to make me retch. Eventually, the body began to catch fire, the flames licking hungrily along his legs and torso. I couldn't bear to watch. Clutching Diesel's collar, I forced us onward, pushing deeper into the forest, away from the lake. I could only pray the fire would keep the demon child, Micah, at bay. My entire body trembled with shock, and Diesel was badly hurt, but we had to keep moving. Sometime later, no clue if it was hours or days, I stumbled across an old trail marker. It looked new, with a bright orange arrow pointing west. Relief battled with suspicion. The arrow wasn't there before, the paint looked fresh. It felt like a trap. But I had nowhere else to go, so I followed it, half convinced I was walking to my doom. The arrow led us to an abandoned shack. Small, rotted boards, a collapsed roof. Diesel and I crept inside. Dust clouded the stale air, but it was shelter from the open woods. I sank against a wall, hugging Diesel, letting exhaustion take me. I dreamt of voices whispering, the hiss of water. I saw the child's face, that grin, and behind him a towering shape of rotted wood and roots that resembled a monstrous tree creature. Time bent in the dream. Sunset to sunrise in rapid flickers. I saw Rachel's corpse pinned under roots, her eyes hollow. She mouthed a plea. "Set me free." I jolted awake. Diesel lay next to me, panting softly. His fur was clammy to the touch, but I couldn't find any serious new injuries. I stumbled outside. The day was bright, but the sun's angle was all wrong again. I no longer trusted my watch. It read 7 a.m. I was unbelievably thirsty. My canteen was nearly empty. The trickle of water from the ravine we'd found was behind us. I had no idea how far. We followed a faint path behind the shack, mostly overgrown with briars. The dryness in my mouth grew worse. Diesel panted heavily, tongue lolled. We needed water, but I was terrified of drinking from the lake or any random puddle in this cursed forest. Eventually, we heard a gentle gurgle and discovered a small creek, water flowing clear over stones. I hesitated, but desperate, I let Diesel drink. Then I filled my canteen. The water tasted normal, though the memory of brackish slime from earlier never left my mind. Just as I was about to rest, I heard a snap. Diesel raised his head, muzzle dripping. Across the creek, partially hidden by cypress roots, stood Micah. He wore the same dirty overalls, feet still bare. He just watched. His eyes had no emotion, though a faint smile curled his lips. My pulse hammered. Without hesitation, I grabbed a large branch to use as a club, stepping forward. "Stay away," I shouted. "You've taken enough from us." Micah remained silent. Then, in a voice that sounded far too deep for a child, he said, "You burned my brother. Now you owe me." Brother? Did he mean Nathan, or something else? My grip on the branch tightened. "I don't owe you anything. You killed Rachel." His eyes narrowed, that grin stretching unnaturally. "She belongs to the lake now." I felt fury boiling over fear. "Let us leave," I demanded. "We never wanted any part of this." Micah blinked slowly, once, twice. Then his face twisted into a rage that made him look older, inhuman. "This place is mine," he hissed. "All lost things belong to me. You're lost, Jake. So is your dog." Adrenaline roared in my veins. I stepped into the creek, brandishing the makeshift club. "We'll see about that." Micah's smile vanished. He rushed forward with startling speed, bounding across the rocks. Diesel barked, lunging. The child moved so fast, skirting around Diesel, that it was impossible to track. I swung the branch, catching only air. Then he was behind me, cackling. He knocked me off balance with a strength I never expected from such a small form. My legs went out from under me, and I slammed onto the creek bank, water soaking my clothes. Diesel whirled, snapping at the boy. Micah swung his arm, and Diesel yelped, collapsing onto his side with a strangled cry. Red blossomed on the dog's flank. Micah had slashed him. I realized, in horror, that Micah clutched a jagged piece of bone, sharpened into a shiv. Diesel whimpered, thrashing. "No!" I cried, struggling to my feet. I lunged, tackling Micah. My hands locked around his arm. I expected the frailty of a child, but his limb felt solid like twisted roots. He snarled, baring teeth that were jagged and dark. I forced his arm back, slamming it against a rock. He shrieked, dropping the bone weapon. My momentum carried us both into the creek. Water splashed around us as we wrestled. I glimpsed his face beneath the water. Eyes wide, mouth parted in a silent wail. A guttural voice echoed in my mind, something alien, screaming in a language I didn't understand. Micah raked his fingers across my chest, drawing blood. Pain flared, but adrenaline fueled me. My only thought was Diesel. I twisted, shoving Micah's head under the rushing water. He thrashed, nails digging into my arms, scraping flesh. The water turned a cloudy red from our blood. I pressed his face down, ignoring my own horror at drowning something that looked like a child. But I reminded myself he wasn't a child, not truly. He kicked, a savage blow to my ribs. I gasped, losing my hold for a second. He surged up, inhaling a ragged breath. Then Diesel lunged in, biting at Micah's shoulder. I took advantage, throwing my body weight on top. Together, Diesel and I forced Micah back under the water. His screams bubbled. That voice in my head grew louder, shriller, threatening to tear my sanity apart. I clenched my jaw, tears mixing with the stream. If I let him go, we'd die. Seconds dragged on in a horrifying eternity. Micah's thrashes weakened, his nails still clawing at my arms, but with less force. At last, his body gave a final spasm and fell limp. The presence in my mind cut off like a static radio going silent. The creek gurgled around us, carrying away swirling threads of blood. I staggered upright, half expecting him to leap back to life. He didn't. His tiny form lay face down, arms bent at unnatural angles. Diesel, panting heavily, limped to the shore. I knelt, pressing a hand to the dog's flank. He was bleeding badly. "Hang on, buddy," I pleaded, voice trembling. I glanced back at Micah's body. I saw it flicker, like my vision was glitching. For a heartbeat, I thought I was hallucinating. Then the body started to dissolve. The flesh collapsed inward, rotting at an impossible rate. Black lumps of mud or algae clung to the skeleton. Within seconds, there was nothing left but a few brittle bones and swirling sediment in the creek. My brain refused to process it. I turned away, choking back bile, and focused on Diesel. He was losing blood from a gash near his hind leg, whimpering each time he moved. I had no medical kit. Most of it had been lost or destroyed. Out of desperation, I tore my shirt into strips and tied them around his wound to stanch the bleeding. He rested his head on his paws, eyes glazed with pain. I stroked his ears, whispered reassurance. If I didn't find help soon, I'd lose him. For the next hour or more, we hobbled along the creek, praying it would lead somewhere. I couldn't carry a dog that size for long, not in my condition, so we moved painfully slow. Every step jarred Diesel's wound. I tried not to think about infection or how much time we might have left. Then, to my shock, I heard a noise that didn't belong to the forest. A distant engine. My heart leapt. Diesel's ears perked. I forced myself into a near sprint, ignoring the pain in my ribs. As I neared a bend in the creek, I saw the glint of metal. A parked truck, white, with a big U.S. Forest Service decal on the side. An older man stood next to it, scanning the tree line with binoculars. I called out, voice cracking. He froze, then spun around, shining a flashlight at me. For a moment, I feared he'd vanish like everything else, but he started running toward me. "Jesus Christ, you look half dead. Hey, easy now. Sit, let me help." I collapsed to my knees, Diesel whimpering at my side. The man introduced himself as a forest ranger, said his name was Dave. He radioed for medical help, though his signal was faint. I kept babbling about a demon child, a rotting lake, a body pinned to a tree. He gave me a concerned look. "We'll get you out of here. Let's just get you both stable first." He produced a first aid kit from his truck, wrapping Diesel's leg better than I had. My eyes kept darting to the tree line, afraid Nathan's burned corpse or something else might emerge. But only the quiet forest surrounded us. When help arrived, it was a small volunteer rescue team with an ATV. They loaded Diesel onto a stretcher, covered me with a blanket, gave me water. Everything felt surreal, like I was stuck in a dream. I kept insisting we had to go back for Rachel's body. Dave exchanged looks with another rescuer, then asked me quietly, "Rachel who?" At the hospital, I told my story to several authorities. They mostly listened with polite dismay, likely chalking it up to shock. When I regained enough strength, I went with a search team to the approximate location where I said I found Rachel's body. We scoured the area for hours. There was no cypress tree with a body pinned underneath. No sign of a tent either, and no sign of Black Lake. They found my truck eventually, half buried on an old logging road miles away, with no campsite anywhere in sight. The truck's battery was dead. Some of the paramedics theorized I'd been delirious from dehydration, that I'd collapsed and hallucinated. Diesel had a real wound, though. One they said might have been from a bear or maybe barbed wire. I insisted that none of that explained the rotting supplies, the warping time, or the bodies. The more I pressed, the more folks started believing I was just another lost hiker who'd gone crazy out there. They did find a phone in my truck bed with photos. In the pictures, I saw me setting up a tent, Diesel by my side. A dark, still water in the background, possibly a lake, but in other photos there were people. Rachel, Nathan. We were all smiling, looking out over the water. The authorities kept asking if those were just friends who'd come camping with me. I explained everything, but they never found Rachel or Nathan, living or dead. They let me go eventually, once my injuries were treated. Diesel came home with me, though his limp never fully went away. Late at night, I sometimes wake to find him standing by the door, growling low as if something outside is calling to him. A few times I found that topographic map on my kitchen table, the route to Black Lake circled in red. I never circled it. The first time it happened, I locked the map away in a drawer. A week later, the map was spread open on my coffee table again. I burnt it in my fireplace, hoping that would be enough. But I still dream of that rotted child, those pitiless gray eyes, and a voice that whispers about Mama's bones in the hush of night. If you don't believe any of this, that's fair. No official record of Black Lake even exists, so I suppose you could call this a hallucination or shared delusion. But I know what I lived through. My body still bears the scars. Diesel's flank is marred from that monstrous bone knife, and my mind, well, my mind will never be the same. Sometimes I wake thinking I hear Nathan's raspy laugh or see Rachel's empty eyes. Other times I sense the forest breathing around me, like it's waiting. I'm telling this in hopes that if someone else out there stumbles across a too-still body of water in Kisatchie National Forest, they'll remember my words. They'll turn around, get back in their car, and never look back. This place, whatever name it truly goes by, devours those who wander too deep. It warps time, rots your mind, leaves you doubting what's real. There are secrets older than any map, older than the cypress themselves, and there's something lurking in those shadows that wears the shape of a child. So that's my story, for what it's worth. I survived, though I can't say if I'm truly free. Sometimes I dream about the cypress roots tearing out of the ground, clutching at my legs, trying to pull me back. I dream that I see Micah's grin in every reflection, and maybe one day he'll succeed in dragging me under. Until that day comes, I hold on to Diesel at night, trying to remind myself that I made it out once, and maybe that means there's hope that the nightmares can't claim me. But the next time I hear the wind howling late at night, and I see Diesel's ears perk, I wonder if it's just the wind, or if somewhere beyond my yard, a small shape in dirty overalls is standing in the dark, beckoning with a too-wide smile. When that happens, I just pray the morning will come. And I pray that time out here still follows the rules, because in that place I left behind, the night can last forever, and the lake is always hungry. My name is Jackson Heller. I'm 32 years old. This happened in October of 2022 when I decided to spend 2 weeks camping deep in Kisatchie National Forest, Louisiana. I wasn't some hardened special ops veteran or anything like that. I was a freelance programmer from Shreveport, burned out from too many late-night coding sessions and endless contract negotiations. My anxiety was spiraling out of control. I needed space to figure myself out. I had a German shepherd named Duke who was my best friend, and I convinced myself that isolation was all I required to get my life back on track. Kisatchie National Forest, as I found out through local lore, is vast, miles and miles of thick pine trees, pockets of hardwoods, red dirt trails that veer off into tangles of brush, and bizarre old ruins from when the Civilian Conservation Corps operated during the Great Depression. Folks I'd spoken to around Natchitoches gave me mixed reactions when I told them where I was headed. Most said, "Enjoy the stars. watch for snakes. Others just gave me strange looks. A few even whispered warnings about some spirit-haunted sections of the forest. I chalked it up to good old-fashioned Southern superstition. But eventually, I found an elderly man who asked where exactly I planned to set up. When I explained I wanted to reach a place as remote as possible, he warned me about an abandoned CCC campsite that hadn't been officially used in decades. He claimed it was cursed. Supposedly, a few hikers had gone missing there over the years. "Stick to the designated campsites," he said, his watery gaze scanning my face. "Don't go there, boy. That patch of Kisatchie belongs to something that doesn't want you." I wish I'd listened. I packed my car and headed out anyway. Late in the afternoon of October 1st, I drove toward a half-legible trailhead, hoping to leave behind everything about my old life. Stress, demands, the hum of traffic. Duke sat in the passenger seat, panting excitedly. The forest road was mostly dirt, with low-hanging branches scraping the roof of my car. The deeper I drove, the more isolated we became, the narrower the path got, until eventually I reached an overgrown parking pull-off where a weather-beaten sign marked the trail. I parked, loaded my pack, and we set off into the green hush. Right away, there was a sense that time moved differently under the canopy of towering pines. The air was thick and damp. I could see a haze of gnats drifting around my face in the late afternoon sun. Duke stayed at my side, occasionally lifting his nose to scent the wind. I carried a GPS to ensure I'd find the CCC site, or at least some vantage point to place my tent. After about 2 miles of trudging, the GPS started glitching. It kept rerouting me back to the highway, but I was sure I had another mile or so to go in the opposite direction. I tried shutting it off and turning it on again. Same issue. That was my first clue something was off, but I assumed it was just poor signal in the thick forest. I'd also brought a paper map, yet I quickly noticed that the footpaths in front of me didn't match the marks on the paper. Waterways seemed to be missing. Where the map predicted a small stream, there was just thick undergrowth. Or, sometimes, I'd see a creek that shouldn't exist. It was around twilight when I finally found what looked like a portion of the old CCC site, a crumbling stone fire ring near a flat patch of ground. Stones jutted from the earth, half buried, covered in moss. Some looked like they might have once been part of a building foundation. The place radiated a lonely, forgotten air. I was exhausted, so I set down my gear and pitched my tent, then used a few broken sticks I found lying around for kindling. A swirl of birds overhead signaled nightfall soon. I tried lighting a campfire. First attempt failed. The second attempt failed. The tinder kept sputtering out. Finally, a small flame took, but it burned with an odd bluish flicker at the edges, then snapped into a pale green glow that died in a hiss. I shivered as if a gust of wind had doused it. Duke stared at the old stone ring and let out a little whine. He never used to be spooked by anything. Storms, fireworks, nothing fazed him. But he lowered his head and stepped behind me. I gave up on the fire, figuring maybe everything was too damp. Instead, I ate a cold dinner of jerky and a granola bar. I turned in early, letting Duke into the tent with me. He curled by my feet, while I read a paperback by the light of a small LED lantern. The forest was strangely quiet. No normal insect chorus. No owls hooting. My own breathing felt amplified in the stillness. When I woke up the next morning, everything was heavier. My phone, which had been charging on a small solar battery bank, was dead. Not just low, completely unresponsive. The bank's LED indicators blinked, but the phone wouldn't power on, like it had been fried. I unzipped my tent and discovered something even stranger. My main backpack, which I'd set against a tree about 20 feet away, was gone. Panic shot through me. I had no illusions about surviving 2 weeks with no supplies. But as I circled the campsite in a frenzy, I found the bag right in the center of my camp. It was wide open, my clothes scattered. Nothing seemed missing. Money, Idaho, food, it was all there, just rummaged through. Duke paced around the perimeter, sniffing. His hackles rose, and he let out a series of low growls. It put me on edge enough that I grabbed my hunting knife. Maybe a wild animal had come sniffing around, but they'd usually tear through food or chew up wrappers. This was different. Carefully, I repacked. If I had any sense, that would have been the moment to leave. The place felt wrong, and the next established campsite was only a day's hike away. But my pride got the best of me. I told myself I needed total solitude. I'd spent so long planning this trip. Quitting now felt like failure. In my mind, I rationalized that perhaps I'd just been half asleep, and Duke had moved the bag trying to nuzzle in for food. It didn't explain everything, but it was enough for me to ignore my nagging fear. That day was fairly uneventful. I tried to get a sense of the area. Tracing faint, overgrown trails, I discovered a collapsed wooden structure, maybe an old cabin or mess hall. I found rusted nails and half-burnt stumps. The entire time I felt like I was being watched. Sometimes the brush would crackle behind me, but whenever I turned there was nothing but forest gloom. I tried collecting wood for another fire in the afternoon. This time, I managed to get the flames going for a few minutes. Normal orange light, and it felt like a small victory. Then, a shifting breeze carried the smell of something foul, like rancid meat, and the flames started sputtering into strange colors again. As soon as they burned green, they flicked out. I coughed, lightheaded from the stench, my eyes watering. That night, I had trouble sleeping. My heart thudded in my chest, and I kept hearing faint footsteps near my tent. Maybe it was a deer or other wildlife, but it sounded bipedal, too deliberate to be an animal. I remember lying there, listening to the soft pad-pad of footsteps. Duke whimpered, pressing closer to me. I must have drifted off eventually. When I woke at dawn, I felt a presence and shot upright. Nothing was inside the tent with me, but the zipper had been undone halfway. My sleeping bag was wide open, unzipped from the inside, but I hadn't done it. My head pounded as if from a night of broken rest. Blinking groggily, I reached for my watch to check the time. The hands read 2:58 a.m., but it was clearly sunrise, maybe 6 or 7 in the morning by the light. I tried tapping the watch face, adjusting the knob. It refused to move. Nothing changed on the dial, just a motionless 2:58. Crawling outside, I found weird footprints. Small, barefoot imprints leading away. Duke sniffed them, then backed off, whining. They looked like a child's footprints. Anxiety rushed in. Had some local kid been wandering around my site in the dead of night, or something else? I hurriedly packed my campsite. The plan was to push deeper into the woods for the next site indicated on my map. Yes, it was further from civilization, but there was no chance I was staying in that same spot with weird footprints all around. But as we walked, everything started getting confusing. My paper map made no sense. Paths would appear and disappear, the topography refusing to match the lines and contours. Whenever I found a creek I expected, it would vanish behind me. A compass I'd brought spun erratically, as if caught in a swirling magnetic field. At one point, I walked for hours in a direction that should have led to a known trail, only to emerge back at the same old CC fire ring. I can't convey the dread of that moment, the realization that I was trapped in some impossible loop. I'd been marching in a straight line, I was sure of it, but I'd returned to the place I started. That day wore on, with me becoming increasingly desperate. Duke was panting, the heat was brutal. My water supply shrank. Sometime in the late afternoon, I collapsed on a mossy rock near the campsite. For a long while, I just stared at the trees. trying to figure out how I'd managed to survive in these bizarre conditions. That was when Duke suddenly let out a snarl so sharp and menacing it jolted me to my feet. A boy stood on the edge of the forest, about 8 years old, wearing tattered shorts and a blank expression. His brown hair clung to his forehead in damp strands. He had no shoes. I wondered if he'd been separated from a family of campers. "Hey!" I called, my voice shaky. Duke growled, the fur on his neck bristling. "Are you lost? Do you need help?" The boy just stared. No recognition in his eyes. No fear, no sadness. Nothing. I was about to approach him when Duke lunged forward, barking furiously. I had never seen him act that way toward a child. I yanked Duke back, worried he might do something drastic. The boy blinked exactly once, then stepped back into the trees and vanished like a ghost. I spent the next half hour searching, calling out, but there was no sign of footprints, no trail in the brush. I used to pride myself on having a level head, but by that point my nerves were unraveling. I was in a forest that refused to match reality, dog-tired from nightmares, and apparently dealing with a barefoot child who popped in and out of nowhere. Sunset approached too soon, the sky flaming red through the canopy. With no success in finding a new place to camp, I surrendered to the idea that I'd have to spend another night at the CCC site. Every shadow around me seemed alive with malicious intent, but I set up the tent as best I could and coaxed Duke inside. I tried to eat a little dinner, some peanut butter on crackers. The peanut butter reeked as if it had rotted overnight. My bread tasted moldy. Even the water in my canteen had a bitter tang. I only managed a few mouthfuls. I kept expecting to see that boy again. Night brought its own horrors. For a time, the forest was so silent I could practically hear my own blood pulsing in my ears. Then I began to detect footsteps, the same near-human footsteps from the previous nights, circling the tent. A soft giggle, impossible to place, drifted under the hush of the wind. I tried to slip into uneasy sleep, one hand curled around my hunting knife. Some part of me recognized the risk. If I truly believed there was a child in danger, I should keep searching. But something primal in me knew that child wasn't normal, and fear pinned me to my sleeping bag. That night, I dreamed of the boy standing right over me, leaning down with wide, unblinking eyes. The dream felt so real. I could smell his breath. It smelled like damp leaves. He parted his lips and I saw teeth that were far too large and jagged for a child's mouth. He reached for me, and that was when I woke to Duke's frantic barking. Duke was gone from the tent. The entrance flap was half unzipped. Heart hammering, I crawled out in the pitch-black darkness. The moon gave the clearing a weak silver light. "Duke?" I called. Silence. Then, from behind a grouping of pines, I heard Duke barking again. I scrambled toward the sound, but my foot caught on exposed roots, and I fell face first into the dirt. By the time I got up, the barking had stopped. Only my ragged breaths broke the quiet. For the next hour, I stumbled around, calling my dog's name, praying I'd see him bounding back, tail wagging. Instead, I found a few muddy paw prints leading straight into a wide pine tree. Not around it, literally into it, as if the tree had swallowed him up. My mind reeled at the impossibility. The bark was unbroken, except for a rough, dark knot that might have looked vaguely like a gaping mouth if I squinted. I pressed my palms to the trunk, calling Duke's name, but no sound came back. Tears burned my eyes. That dog was my anchor, my best friend. I was too stunned to do anything but slump against the trunk, letting my confusion congeal into dread. Eventually, I returned to camp. I had no idea what else to do. But to my utter astonishment, Duke was there, lying by my tent, panting. He looked completely normal, or at least I thought he did at first. I rushed over, relief flooding me. "Duke, my God, buddy, you're okay." He turned his head slowly, regarding me with indifference. Duke would normally have jumped all over me, licking my face, but he just stared. Then, in a fluid, unnatural way, he stood up on all fours and padded closer. That was when my relief fractured. His eyes, usually so expressive, were dull, glassy. He didn't seem to focus on me at all. As I inspected him, I noticed an odd quiver in his body, like the faintest tremor. He opened his mouth and a weird, rasping sound came out. I expected a whine, or maybe a low bark, but it was more like a child's voice whispering, just a single word I couldn't catch. My heart pounded. Was I hallucinating from stress and exhaustion? I crouched, whispering to him, and reached out to scratch his ears. His ear felt unnaturally stiff. Then, as if in slow motion, he parted his jaws. A voice that did not belong to my dog emerged, high and toneless, like a kid's. "You're not supposed to be here." I recoiled, stumbling back. My brain refused to accept it. Duke?" I stammered. His mouth opened again, and the same child's voice repeated, "Not supposed to be here." Before I could do anything, Duke lunged at me, teeth snapping. I scrambled back, letting out a strangled yelp. The dog's jaws extended too far, drool and something black dripping out. He sprang, and I managed to twist sideways, sending him into the side of the tent. The thin nylon tore. Adrenaline propelled me to my feet. I clutched my hunting knife, an old 8-inch blade with a carved grip. "Duke, please," I cried, tears streaming down my face, but it wasn't my dog anymore. It snarled, a low, guttural hiss crossing with that childlike timbre. We circled each other in the moonlight. My mind spun in disbelief. The shape, the fur, it looked so much like my dog, but it moved wrong. Glitchy, almost, as though each motion had half a second of delay. The stench of decay rolled off it. He lunged again, and I swung the knife in desperation. It hit the flank, shallow cut, but enough to draw some inky fluid. He yelped, staggering, then turned, baring teeth. They looked like shards of bone and black gums. I thought I was about to die. I braced myself to stab again, and that's when a flicker of something passed across the dog's face. For the briefest moment, I saw Duke's real eyes, confused and scared, as if he were pinned behind glass. Then the unnatural presence reasserted itself, twisting the dog's features. I roared in fury, or maybe heartbreak, and stabbed as he came at me again. The blade sank into flesh that felt hollow. The fur rippled beneath my hand, slithering. Something inside felt like it was filled with hair and shards of bone instead of muscle or organs. The creature let out an awful cry, half animal, half child. I wrestled it onto its side, my body trembling. Blackish fluid smeared over my hand. The creature's chest rose and fell once. Then the muscles went slack. I knelt there, panting, knife still embedded in this twisted mockery of Duke. Slowly, the fur receded, the body shrinking. My eyes watered as the shape melted into something unrecognizable, like rotting cloth, stuffed with bits of fur, teeth, and fingernails. That impossibility, that vile metamorphosis, hammered me with such force that I started retching. When I pulled the knife out, the remains collapsed into a heap of bracken and gore, as though the shape had never been my dog in the first place. I stumbled away, tears streaming. Where was Duke? Did I just kill him, or some imitation? Then I noticed the footprints. Small footprints in the dirt behind me, belonging to that boy. They approached my campsite from the darkness. A voice that sounded eerily like my own whispered, "Duke is gone," with a faint, mocking laugh. Rage overcame me. I whirled to confront whoever or whatever was there, but only the quiet forest remained. My face was wet with tears, heart twisted with a guilt-laced fury. If that thing had truly just been a copy, then was Duke still alive somewhere? Or was he devoured by the forest? Shaking, I decided I had to get out. Screw the plan. I needed to find any route back to civilization, or at least a stronger vantage point. The rest of that night I didn't sleep. I huddled near the smoldering remains of a makeshift fire I'd forced to burn by piling extra tinder and dousing it in the last of my isopropyl alcohol. The flame flickered greenish at times, lurching in the breeze. I kept my knife drawn, occasionally leaning forward to coax the fire. In the dim pre-dawn, I saw him again, the boy, standing among the tree trunks, just beyond the flicker of flame. He didn't come closer. He just watched. I caught a glimpse of his eyes. They were black, like lumps of coal. My legs shook, but I managed to bark out a question. "Why are you doing this? Where's my dog?" He grinned. The corners of his mouth stretched too far. Then he melted away into the gloom. I packed what little I could and limped away from that cursed spot at sunrise. I say limped because at some point during the night's madness, I twisted or strained my ankle. The pain was manageable, but every step hurt. With the tension high, I traveled in any direction that felt new, ignoring the nonsense of my map, ignoring the defunct GPS. My only real goal was to find water, follow it downstream until I found a road or sign of people. I had a canteen that I could hopefully refill. Half the day passed in this aimless march, but the terrain kept looping in on itself. Several times I recognized certain crooked trees, or the remnants of that old CCZ building. The forest seemed to shift behind my back. My compass spun so wildly it was useless. By mid-afternoon I found a path that looked different from the rest, lined with thick, gnarled oak trees. I followed it, ignoring the sense of doom in my gut. A sudden wave of dizziness overcame me, like I'd stepped into a bubble of warped reality. The shadows elongated, and the sky overhead looked more like dusk than midday. Then I saw him, Duke, standing in the middle of the path, muzzle lowered, tail wagging. A tiny, hopeful wag. I nearly sobbed with joy. "Duke!" I shouted. Dropping to a crouch, arms wide, he limped toward me, and my heart sank. He seemed covered in shallow cuts, dried blood caking his fur. But his eyes were bright and warm with recognition. He let out a weak bark. I threw my arms around him, ignoring the stench of dried blood. "God, you're alive!" I whispered, choking on emotion. We stayed like that for a few seconds, and it felt real. His body was solid, breathing, a warmth that the other abomination lacked. I cried, pressing my face into his neck. In that moment, time blurred. I smelled something sweet and sickly, and it felt like the forest was swirling around us. Suddenly, I saw the boy standing behind Duke. His hand was pressed to Duke's flank, so gentle. I scrambled to my feet, brandishing my knife. "Stay away!" I yelled at the boy, but he stared, expressionless, as though my threat meant nothing. A wave of disorientation hit me, and I looked back at Duke. His eyes flickered, warm brown to a cloudy black, then back to brown. He let out a quiet whine, and I could sense a conflict inside him, as though something else was trying to take control. Before I could react, Duke yelped and collapsed. It was like all his strength drained out in an instant. I caught him, dropping the knife, tears streaking my face. He was breathing, shallow but alive. "No, no, no," I cried, shaking him. The boy took a step closer. I snatched my knife off the ground and held it up, trembling. "What do you want from us?" With a voice that resonated like multiple pitches overlapping, he said, "You're not supposed to be here." I lunged, fear giving me a burst of courage. I slashed at him, but he melted backward impossibly fast. My blade only cut empty air. He seemed to glide out of reach, that same vacant expression pinned to his face. Then everything blurred. I can only explain it as a time distortion. The sky overhead flickered. Bright morning light, then twilight, then midday again, in the span of seconds. Trees grew and shrank. The forest hummed with an eerie, bass-like tone. I stumbled, retching. Duke disappeared from my arms. The boy was gone too. When I blinked, I was back at the CC site, as though no time had passed. Or maybe days had passed. The sun was now sinking low in a red haze. My watch still read 2:58 a.m. My phone was dead in my pocket. My body was soaked in sweat, and my mouth was so dry it felt like sand. The half-burnt remains of my fire still lay in the same ring. The tattered tent, with slashes from the night before, stood empty. My food supply stank of mold and rot. The peanut butter jar in my hand was fuzzy with greenish lumps. I realized I was losing my mind, or else the forest was twisting reality. I needed water. I found a small creek to refill my canteen, but the water was brackish, speckled with floating debris. I used water purification tablets, but it still tasted foul. With shaky determination, I told myself, I'm leaving. Even if it takes me a year, I can't keep playing this game. I started hacking through brush in a straight line due west. The sun was to my left, so I tried to keep it there. No more messing with loops. But the same phenomenon happened. Even going straight, I ended up back where I began. The second time, I discovered a partial clearing where the ground looked scorched, with blackened stumps. I realized it was the same clearing from different angles. Frantic, I built a small cairn of stones to mark my path, then marched on. 30 minutes later, I came upon the same cairn, as though I had circled back. I tried the same approach heading north, then east. Every time, I ended back at the cursed CCC site, as though the forest were folding in on itself. By nightfall, I was slumped against the stone ring, rummaging through my gear for anything that might help. The sense of being trapped in a living nightmare made me feel like an animal, pinned and desperate. That was when I noticed something in my journaling notebook. I used to keep it to track my daily tasks and schedules for programming gigs. Several pages were filled with writing that I didn't recall doing. Shaking, I flipped through them. Dates that hadn't happened yet were scrawled across the top. Strange sketches of trees, figures with black eyes, even a monstrous dog-like shape. My own handwriting. One entry read, "He kills Duke tonight." I stared at it, horrified. That had already happened in a sense. But had I truly killed Duke, or just that imitation? Another entry, further on, read, "Stop resisting. This place is inside you now." I dropped the notebook. My skin crawled, the hair on my arms prickling as if invisible spiders were scuttling over me. The wind rustled. I heard footsteps behind me. Turning, I saw a figure emerge from the tree line. For a moment, I thought it was the boy again, but this figure was tall, the silhouette matching my own. Moonlight revealed his face. My face. Only, with the eyes dark and sunken, the cheeks hollowed. The doppelganger wore my same outfit smeared with blackish sap. I couldn't breathe. I watched my double step into the clearing, a lopsided grin twisting his features. It was as if he were half a second out of sync with reality, every movement glitching. "What do you want?" I croaked. He only smiled, revealing black teeth. Then he spoke in my voice. "You're not supposed to be here." I scrambled back, brandishing the knife. The figure advanced, slow and deliberate. I realized with horror that there was no way I could physically fight something that wore my skin. At that moment, there was a growl from the shadows. I jerked my head to see the real Duke, wounds matted in his fur, charging at my double. Relief and fear mingled. The doppelganger hissed, shifting its face in jerky contortions. Duke lunged, clamping his jaws onto the figure's arm. I seized the chance. I lunged forward, stabbing the thing in the back. It screeched, a sound that caused the trees to tremble, leaves falling in a swirl. Duke yelped as black fluid sprayed from the wound. In the confusion, the figure spun and struck me with unnatural force, sending me sprawling. My ankle twisted, and I felt a sharp crack. Pain flared through my leg so severely I thought I'd pass out. The next thing I knew, Duke was by my side, whimpering, and the doppelganger was gone. I clutched Duke's fur, gasping through the agony in my ankle. The dog licked my face gently. For a fleeting second, I felt some relief that he was there, that we were together, even in this hell. That night was a blur of pain, fear, and slow madness. My ankle swelled, rendering me incapable of walking. Duke lay next to me, letting out a small whine whenever I shifted. He was hurt too, still bearing raw scratches and missing fur patches, but he seemed determined to stay awake, as if guarding me. During those dark hours, the forest itself felt like it was twisting in on us. The sky flickered from star-studded black to dawn's glow in waves. Sometimes I heard laughter, childlike, hidden in the pines. Other times the rustling of many footsteps. Now and then I'd see the small footprints appear in the dirt, dancing around in circles. My sense of time vanished entirely. I lost track of how many days I drifted in that delirious state. Maybe it was only one night, maybe longer. My food supply had all gone foul. My water was dangerously low. In my few moments of consciousness, I tried to gather my thoughts, but it was near impossible. At one point, I woke to see Duke slinking away, his ears flat. He must have heard something. I tried to call him back, but my voice came out in a rasp. The next time I awoke, he was gone, and I was alone. Despair flooded me. I had no way to move more than a few feet without excruciating pain. Crawling was possible, but where would I go? The forest was an endless loop. Through half-lidded eyes, I saw a flicker of movement. The boy stepped into the clearing again, black-eyed, barefoot. He stood, head tilted, as if studying me. My voice cracked. "Take me instead. Let my dog go," I begged. "Please." He advanced, and the air grew bitterly cold. My breath misted. He crouched beside me, studying my face with a childlike curiosity. Then he reached out and touched my wounded ankle. A wave of pain shot up my leg and I screamed, tears streaming. He whispered in that layered voice, "Stop resisting." My mind reeled. I could feel something invading my thoughts, twisting inside my skull. Night sky melted into day, day into night, swirling. I saw flashes of my childhood bedroom, my mother's face, the corridor of a hospital, then back to the forest. Finally, I latched onto a memory. Duke as a puppy, the joy he brought me, my heart clenched with fierce devotion. With every ounce of will I had, I shoved the boy's presence out of my mind. He hissed, a shadow crossing his face, and jerked back his hand. Anger twisted his youthful features, making him look ancient. Summoning my last bit of nerve, I lunged up, gripping him by the wrist. He felt solid as flesh. Surprising him, I stabbed with my knife. He cried out in a shrill, furious wail. The sky flickered, like a television losing signal. I saw the forest shifting, warping. The boy stumbled away, clutching the wound in his side. His form shimmered, revealing something monstrous. Limbs too long, skin grooved like tree bark, eyes like polished glass. He was no child, just an abomination wearing a child's shape. I forced myself to stand, pain in my ankle flaring, and hobbled forward. The demon creature, calling itself Isaiah, or perhaps it had no name, slammed me back with a force I can't describe. My vision darkened at the edges, spots flaring. When the world came back into focus, the boy was gone, but the entire clearing seemed to be shimmering like a mirage. A single pine tree with a large, wounded knot in its trunk drew my gaze. It bled black sap that hissed on the ground. My mind raced. Somehow, that tree seemed central. Maybe that was the reason everything was warping. Summoning my meager strength, I crawled to my pack. I found my little canister of isopropyl alcohol, used for cleaning cuts and occasionally assisting with fires, though it was nearly empty. I also had my flint and steel. I half crawled, half dragged myself toward the pine. The bark was unnaturally warm under my hand, pulsing like it had a heartbeat. The black sap smelled like rotten eggs. Teeth chattering from pain and fear, I poured the alcohol into the knot and struck my flint. Sparks danced. The sap ignited with a whoosh, sending greenish flames licking up the trunk. The tree groaned, a deep, rumbling sound that vibrated the ground. Then everything lurched. The forest screamed, not a human cry, but something else. The sound of all the trees bending and shrieking in unison. A wind kicked up, swirling embers. I covered my face with my arm. I glimpsed the boy's shape, the demon, Isaiah, writhing among the flames, his eyes wide with fury, his flesh cracked like bark, black sap pouring out. He howled, a piercing cry that turned my bones to ice. Duke, I thought. Where was Duke? The flames whipped higher, and Isaiah's shriek rose in pitch until it faded into a deafening silence. My ankle gave out, and I collapsed. I remember the world spinning, the forest flickering from day to night again. I caught glimpses of shapes in the smoke. Dozens of children, men, women, all with black eyes, all swirling around me. My doppelganger was there too, face contorted. They dissolved into drifting ash as the tree burned. Eventually, the tree fell, crashing onto the old CC fire ring. Sparks rained in every direction. I managed to roll away enough to avoid being crushed. For a moment, I wondered if I'd die anyway, pinned under the thick trunk. But I was spared. Dawn light glimmered. My watch still read 2:58, but by the position of the sun it had to be daybreak. I lay there trembling, exhaustion and pain ravaging me. Time felt linear again. No flickering, no sense of shifting. Then I heard footsteps, real human footsteps, accompanied by a voice calling, "Hello? Anyone out here?" My heart soared and sank all at once. I tried to call back, but my voice came out in a wheeze. I forced myself to crawl, inch by inch, ignoring the agony of my ankle. I glimpsed two figures in ranger uniforms stepping into the clearing. "Over here," I managed, lifting an arm. They rushed over. One had a radio. They looked stunned by the smoldering pine trunk, the charred earth, and my battered state. The older ranger knelt beside me, checking my pulse. "Jesus, we've been searching for you," he said. "You okay, son?" Before I could answer, the second ranger whistled softly, spotting the remains of that hideous, half-burnt mass near the trunk. Bits of fur and bone from the fake dog. My stomach churned as I remembered the horrifying shape, but the ranger frowned, apparently unsure what it was. At that moment, I realized Duke was nowhere in sight. I tried to lift my head. "My dog, have you seen him?" The ranger shook his head. "Afraid not. Just you." They got me onto a makeshift stretcher, calling for a helicopter evac due to the severity of my ankle. My entire body shook from adrenaline and dehydration. But a huge part of me was screaming inside, "Where's Duke? Did the demon kill him? Did I lose him forever?" I was so delirious that I only caught fragments of conversation. The rangers said they'd found a trail of footprints. One looked human, the other canine, leading in circles around the clearing. They asked me what happened. I only managed half-coherent mutterings about a demon, a boy, illusions. They exchanged a glance that conveyed doubt or pity. "We'll figure it out," they assured me. By the time the helicopter arrived, I was drifting in and out of consciousness. Pain kept spiking, and the medics did what they could. I remember lifting my gaze as they hoisted me into the chopper, and for a moment, I locked eyes with one of the paramedics. My blood went cold. There was something about his face, a slight twist at the edge of his mouth, an uncanny glimmer in his eyes that made me think of that grin. But maybe it was just my fear talking. I blacked out. The next clear memory was waking up in a hospital room in Shreveport. My leg was in a cast, IV lines in my arm. The doctor told me I was lucky to be alive. Hikers sometimes lose their way in Kisatchie, he said. You had a severe ankle fracture, dehydration, mild infection from that open wound. It's a miracle you managed as long as you did. He asked me if I had a next of kin. I said no, that it was just me and my dog. A pained expression crossed his features. They only found you, he said softly. While I was recovering, local authorities questioned me. I gave them a rambling account of what happened. Their faces said they didn't believe the more supernatural elements. The official story was that I got disoriented, lost my dog, and suffered a mental break after days alone without enough food or water. No matter how I tried to explain the horrifying things I saw, they just nodded politely or told me to rest. Evidence of the strange goings-on was probably lost in that clearing. I had no camera footage. My phone was fried. The weird remains I'd shown the rangers apparently burned into ash. Some said maybe it was a decomposed deer carcass or a dead boar. On the 5th day in the hospital, a deputy came to tell me they'd combed the area where I was found. No sign of a living German shepherd, he said gently. We're sorry. My heartbreak was immeasurable. Duke might still be out there if he survived, but the rational part of me doubted it. I'd seen him vanish, seen the illusions wearing his shape, and heard that horrifying boy talk in his voice. When the doctors finally discharged me, I limped out of the hospital with a medical boot, my leg throbbing at every step. One of the rangers who'd helped rescue me was waiting in the lobby. I recognized him as the older one. Foster, I think his name was. He gave me a sober look. You gave us a scare, he said. I wanted to let you know we found an old campsite near where we got you. Seemed to date back a few decades, maybe older. We also found some personal effects. He hesitated, as though carefully choosing his words. Child-sized footprints in the clearing, too, but no child anywhere. We'll keep an eye out for your dog. I thanked him, though my mind whirled with all the implications. I couldn't find any words that made sense. Did they see the charred remains of that pine tree? Had they felt the suffocating evil that lurked there? I never got a satisfying answer. Over time, I tried to settle back into life, but insomnia clawed at me every night. The cast eventually came off, though I walked with a limp for months. Sometimes, I'd feel the pain flaring, and I'd recall the touch of that boy's hand on my ankle. Friends and acquaintances who heard about my ordeal tried to comfort me, saying Duke might have run off and found a new home. But the memory of that monstrous copy in the firelight, the black fluid, will never leave me. To this day, I dream of that clearing. In my nightmares, the forest flickers through day and night, and I see multiple versions of myself standing in the shadows. Duke is there too, sometimes whole and happy, sometimes twisted and wrong, his eyes black. The barefoot boy stands next to him, whispering, "You're not supposed to be here." I wake up in a cold sweat, stifling a scream. No matter how much therapy I do, or how many times I tell myself it was just a hallucination brought on by starvation and fear, the nightmares remain vivid. Sometimes, I'll catch a glimpse of my reflection in the bathroom mirror and swear it's half a second too slow to match my movements. Other nights, I'll wake and sense someone has unzipped my bedding from the inside. My phone occasionally malfunctions at exactly 2:58 a.m., shutting off for no reason. Every time, it feels like a piece of that forest is still clinging to me. It's been a year since I limped out of Kisatchie. Not a day goes by that I don't think about Duke and wonder if, in some twisted corner of those woods, he's still alive, or if he died a slow death at the hands of that demon. If I'm honest, there's a part of me that's terrified he might come back, because what if it's not really him? In quiet moments, I remember that final confrontation with the burning tree. I recall how the demon's illusions burned away, like some malevolent parasite forced back by fire. And I pray that nobody else stumbles into that place, because I know now that Kisatchie is more than just a forest. Something ancient dwells there, something that twists reality and devours the living. If anyone tries to repeat my mistake, I can only hope they have the sense to turn around when the local old-timers give them those warnings, or when their fire suddenly burns green. I survived, but only physically. Part of me never left those woods. Even as I write this, I feel eyes on the back of my neck, as if the forest watches from every shadow. Sometimes I wonder if one day, when the clock reads 2:58 a.m., I'll glance over my shoulder and see him again. That barefoot boy, dark-eyed, waiting silently, waiting to drag me back.